Hey everyone, welcome to Camping Horror Stories. Every year, campers disappear in Nebraska's vast wilderness. Some are found, but most are not. Those who return whisper of strange figures in the trees, distant voices calling their names, and an overwhelming feeling that something is hunting them. Tonight, we dive into the terrifying encounters of campers who heard these voices and lived to regret it. Are you brave enough to listen? Subscribe and turn on notifications if you dare. Story 1. They say Nebraska is flyover country. Honestly, before last summer, I probably would have agreed. Born and raised in the concrete canyons of New York City, wide open spaces were something you saw in movies, not something you actively sought out. But after the pandemic years cooped up in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, the idea of endless horizons and big skies started to sound less like boring and more like salvation. I'd always been a sucker for those Instagram ads promising freedom on the open road, the kind with a shiny RV parked against a fiery sunset. So maybe it was a midlife crisis 35, or maybe it was just plain cabin fever, but I decided to do it. I rented a mid-size RV, the Wanderer. They cheesily called it packed up my essentials and a surprisingly large amount of bug spray, and pointed myself west. Destination Nebraska. My plan was simple: a week of solitude, nature, and maybe finally finishing that novel I'd been working on for the last 5 years. I charted a course through the western part of the state, aiming for some of the less traveled state parks and forests. I imagined myself grilling steaks under a canopy of stars, hiking through golden prairies, and returning to the city a new man, refreshed and inspired. The first few days were fine. Nebraska is definitely flat, and the cornfields went on forever, just like everyone says. But there was a stark beauty to it, too. The sunsets were indeed spectacular, painting the sky in shades I'd never seen back east. I found a decent campground near the Niobrara River, hooked up, the Wanderer, and even managed to grill a steak without setting the RV on fire. Progress. But as the days went on, a subtle unease started to creep in. It wasn't anything concrete, just a feeling. The silence, which had initially been so appealing, started to feel heavy. At night, parked in these vast, empty spaces, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the distant, lonely howl of coyotes. And it was silent. No city hum, no traffic, just the wind whispering through the tall grass and the rhythmic creaking of the RV in the breeze. One evening, parked at a particularly isolated spot near the edge of the Nebraska National Forest, I was sitting outside trying to write. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was bleeding into shades of purple and orange. Beautiful, right? Except the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but it was there, a low, rhythmic drumming. Thump, thump, thump. I paused my writing, listened intently. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't an animal. It sounded mechanical, but organic at the same time, like a giant, slow heartbeat echoing across the plains. I scanned the horizon, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing. Just endless grassland fading into the darkening sky. The drumming continued, a steady, unsettling pulse that seemed to vibrate right through the ground and into my bones. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it faded away, leaving behind an even deeper silence. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe some distant farm equipment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something watching. That night I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded amplified. Menacing. I kept imagining that drumming sound and the vast, empty darkness pressing in around me. I started to wonder if this escape was such a good idea after all. Maybe the city, with all its noise and chaos, was a kind of comfort blanket I hadn't appreciated until it was gone. The next morning, I decided to move on. I packed up, the Wanderer, eager to put some miles between myself and that unsettling sound. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me. But as I drove away, glancing back in my rearview mirror at the empty, windswept landscape, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, something that was now aware of me and wasn't happy to see me go. I aimed for Scotts Bluff National Monument. I figured a national park would be safer. More people, rangers, official maps, the kind of things that push back the edges of the unknown. The drive was long and monotonous, the landscape unchanging. popcorn sky repeat. But the drumming sound was gone, and for that I was grateful. I tried to convince myself it was just a fluke, a trick of the wind in the wide open spaces. Nebraska was just big, big and empty, and my city, tuned senses were probably just misinterpreting things. Scottsbluff itself was impressive, rising out of the plains like a giant, ancient ship. I parked, the Wanderer, at the visitor center campground, which thankfully had a few other RVs scattered around. Seeing other people, even just at a distance, eased my nerves. I spent the afternoon hiking some of the trails, taking pictures of the dramatic cliffs and the panoramic views. It was beautiful undeniably. The vastness was still there, but somehow, with the marked trails and the distant murmur of other tourists, it felt less oppressive. That evening back at the RV, I decided to try and relax. I made a proper dinner, cracked open a beer, and even managed to write a few hundred words of my novel, mostly descriptions of prairie sunsets and vaguely ominous wind sounds naturally. As dusk settled, I turned on the RV's radio, hoping for some background noise, some human voices to push back the silence. Static, just a wall of white noise hissing from the speakers. I fiddled with the dial, scanning through the stations. More static. Then a flicker of music, a country song twanging in and out of the noise, before dissolving back into the hiss. I kept turning the dial station after station, but it was all the same. Static, brief bursts of garbled music or talk radio, then back to static. Great reception out here, I muttered to myself sarcastically. I knew rural areas could have spotty radio, but this felt different, like something was actively interfering, drowning out any signal. Then, cutting through the static, I heard it, a voice. Faint, distorted, almost swallowed by the noise, but definitely a voice. It sounded like a child. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio dial. I strained to hear, turning up the volume, fighting against the static that threatened to consume it. Lost, the voice whispered. So lost, it was high-pitched, breathy, definitely a child's voice. But there was something wrong with it. A flatness, a lack of inflection that made it sound less like a real child and more like a recording. A very old, very damaged recording. Can't find a way home. The voice continued, the words broken and fragmented, barely audible above the static. My heart started to pound. This couldn't be real, could it? A kid on the radio broadcasting through static. It had to be some kind of weird prank, or maybe a local art project gone wrong. But the sheer unlikelihood of it, combined with the unsettling feeling that had been building since I arrived in Nebraska, sent a shiver of genuine fear down my spine. I reached for the dial, intending to switch off the radio, to banish the creepy voice back into the static from whence it came. But as my fingers brushed the knob, the voice changed. It became clearer, louder, the static receding slightly, as if the radio itself was somehow focusing. And the words were no longer whispered, no longer fragmented. They were spoken directly, clearly right into my ears. Jakey. My blood ran cold. My name, it said my name. Through the radio static, a child's voice somehow knowing my name. I ripped my hand away from the radio dial like it was burning me. The static surged back, louder than ever, drowning out everything. I slammed the power button, plunging the RV into silence. The silence was worse. Now it wasn't just the natural silence of the prairie night. It was a silence that felt expectant. Like something was listening, waiting for me to speak, to react. I sat there frozen in the darkness of the RV, the radio a dead, black box in the corner. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was something else. Something real and something terrifying. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the lights on. Every light in the RV blazing, as if light itself could somehow ward off whatever was whispering through the static. I stared at the radio, willing it to stay silent, willing the voice to stay gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever had spoken my name through the static was still out there, in the Nebraska darkness, and it was calling to me. And I had a terrible feeling that it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Morning came, pale and weak, filtering through the RV windows. I felt like I hadn't blinked all night. The radio remained stubbornly silent, just static when I dared to turn it on. But the child's voice that was burned into my brain. Jakey, just the sound of it, that flat, dead tone, was enough to send shivers down my spine. I knew I had to leave Scott's Bluff. This wasn't the peaceful escape I'd imagined. This was something else. Something I didn't understand and frankly didn't want to. I needed to get back to civilization, back to noise and people, and the comforting anonymity of the city. I packed up, the wanderer, in record time skipping breakfast, barely glancing at the majestic bluff looming in the distance. I just wanted to go. Get out of Nebraska. Put as much space as possible between myself and that voice, that feeling of being watched. I punched my Brooklyn address into the GPS and started driving east. The endless highway stretched before me, shimmering in the heat haze. For a while, the sheer act of driving, of moving away, was enough to calm my frayed nerves. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist, and the landscape slowly began to change, the dramatic bluffs giving way to rolling hills, and eventually back to cornfields. Comforting, familiar cornfields. I stopped for gas and coffee in a small town, the first real town I'd seen since leaving the campground. Just seeing other people, hearing normal human chatter, felt like a balm to my soul. I even managed a weak smile at the cashier. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe the voice was just a radio glitch, a weird atmospheric anomaly. But as I drove on, the feeling of unease returned, creeping back like a shadow in the afternoon sun. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a sense of expectation. Like something was still listening, still watching, even miles away from Scott's Bluff. Then I noticed it. In the rearview mirror. A flicker of movement at the edge of the highway, in the heat-distorted distance. I squinted, trying to focus. Nothing, just heat shimmer and endless asphalt. I told myself it was just my imagination, road fatigue, anything but what my gut was screaming. A few miles further it happened again. Another flicker of movement in the mirror, closer this time. And then I saw it clearly, unmistakably. A figure. Small. Dark, standing at the side of the road, watching me. Billy, it was him. The same ragged clothes, the pale face, the dark hair plastered to his forehead. Standing by the side of a busy highway, miles from Red Hollow, just watching. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. He was just a kid, right? A creepy, unsettling kid, but still just a kid. He couldn't have followed me, could he? Not for this distance, not a nodist. I sped up, pressing down on the gas pedal, the RV rumbling and straining. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. He was still there. Still standing by the side of the road, watching, but now closer. Much closer. It was like he was gliding, effortlessly keeping pace with the RV, despite the speed. Panic seized me. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But I was seeing it, seeing him. In my mirror, that small, pale figure keeping pace with my speeding RV. I swerved, abruptly pulling off the highway onto a smaller side road, hoping to lose him, to shake him off. The side road was dirt, red Nebraska dirt, kicking up in clouds behind, the wanderer. I bounced and rattled along, branches scraping against the RV's sides, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. He was still there, still following, still gliding effortlessly, impossibly, and now he was smiling. That same unsettling, too wide grin from the churchyard, but now triumphant, like he knew he had me. The side road twisted and turned, leading deeper and deeper into nowhere. Just more endless fields broken by the occasional rusted out farm implement or dilapidated barn. And then I saw it, ahead, through the heat haze, rising out of the flat landscape like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. A rusted metal archway, half collapsed, red dirt swirling around its base. The sign from Red Hollow. No, this couldn't be happening. I'd driven away from Red Hollow. Miles away. How could I be back? Red Hollow. Or another Red Hollow. A twisted, mocking echo of the place I'd tried to escape. The road led directly towards it, no other turns, no escape. It was like the road itself was pulling me in, guiding me back to the nightmare. And in the mirror, Billy was no longer smiling. He was beckoning. A small hand raised, fingers curled, urging me forward into Red Hollow. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding in the red dirt, throwing up a cloud of dust. I threw the gear shift into reverse, desperate to back out, to escape this impossible loop. But the wheels just spun, digging deeper into the soft earth, the RV stubbornly refusing to move. Stuck. I was stuck. I killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. The wind whispered through the tall grass. carrying the scent of dry earth and something else. Something metallic, something like rust and old blood. I looked in the rearview mirror. Billy was gone. The road behind me was empty, just red dirt and shimmering heat. But I knew he was here. I could feel them, all around me, in the silence, in the wind, in the very air I was breathing. I was back in Red Hollow, or a Red Hollow, and this time there was no escape. The RV was stuck, the road was gone, and whatever had called me back was waiting. I took a deep breath, the air thick and heavy in my lungs. I knew what I had to do. I had to face it. Whatever they were in this cursed place. Running wasn't going to work. Hiding wasn't going to work. There was only one way out now. Through. I opened the RV door, the metal groaning in the heat. I stepped out onto the red dirt, the Nebraska sun beating down on my face. The air was still expectant. And in the distance, beyond the rusted archway, I heard it. Faint at first, then growing louder, echoing across the empty landscape. Child's laughter, high, sweet, and utterly terrifyingly wrong. They were waiting, and I was finally irrevocably home. Story 3. My name's Jake, and up until last October, I considered myself a pretty rational guy. Engineer by trade, logical, like things in their place. You know the type. My wife, Sarah. Bless her heart, she's more free-spirited. Artist, always chasing sunsets and vibes, as she calls them. Usually we balance each other out, but this time, Sarah's free spirit nearly got us both killed in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. It started, like most bad ideas do, with Pinterest. Sarah gets these urges, let's call them, to reconnect with nature. This time, it manifested as a full-blown obsession with RV camping. Nebraska specifically. "Think about it, Jay," she'd exclaimed, scrolling through photos of endless skies and golden fields on her tablet. Wide open spaces, no light pollution, just us and the stars. We could finally get away from the city noise. From everything. Honestly, I was worn down. Work had been a pressure cooker, and the constant hum of Chicago was starting to feel like a physical weight. Sarah's eyes, all bright and hopeful, were hard to say no to. Plus, I'll admit, the pictures were pretty. So against my better judgment, I agreed. We rented a decent-sized RV as Sarah insisted on for comfort, which, knowing her, meant room for all her art supplies and crystals, and started planning our escape to the Cornhusker State. We mapped out a route to Broken Bow, Nebraska. Sarah picked it because of some article she read about it being a hidden gem with unspoiled landscapes. I just nodded and pretended to be enthusiastic while secretly checking the RV's emergency kit and making sure we had enough cell phone chargers. My idea of roughing it is a hotel with slightly less fancy shampoo. Our departure day was crisp and sunny, the kind of fall day that makes you almost forget winter is coming. We packed the RV. Sarah humming some folksy tune, me double-checking the tire pressure. Emily, Sarah's best friend, was joining us. Emily's a lawyer sharp as a tack, and usually the voice of reason in our little trio. But even Emily seemed caught up in the romantic idea of escaping to Nebraska. "Think of the Instagrams, Jake," she'd joked, though I knew there was a part of her that genuinely craved the quiet too. The drive was long, mind-numbingly long. Illinois flattened into Iowa, and then finally, we crossed the Missouri River into Nebraska. The landscape shifted just like Sarah promised. The city faded into rolling hills, then into vast stretches of farmland. The sky, though it was enormous, you could actually see the curve of the earth out here. It was impressive, I'll give her that. We arrived in Broken Bow late afternoon. It was smaller than I expected, more of a blink and you'll miss it kind of town. We stocked up on groceries at a local store. Everyone was friendly, if a little reserved, maybe. Hard to put my finger on it. Then, we followed Sarah's GPS directions to our campsite, which was supposed to be just outside of town near a place called Whispering Pines Campground. The name already gave me the creeps. The road turned from paved to gravel, then to something barely more than a dirt track. Trees closed in around us, thicker and darker than anything we'd seen on the drive. The sunlight started to fade and the air got colder, a damp bone, chilling cold that seeped right into you. Sarah, still cheerful, pointed to a small, weathered wooden sign barely visible through the trees. Whispering Pines Campground, next left. I signaled, turned the RV, and we plunged into the woods. The trees were so dense here. It felt like twilight even though the sun hadn't fully set. The RV bumped and swayed on the uneven track, branches scraping against the sides. It was getting darker, and the wide open spaces of Nebraska suddenly felt a lot more claustrophobic. I glanced at Sarah in the passenger seat. Her smile was gone. Even she was starting to look a little uneasy. Maybe, just maybe, this whole reconnecting with nature thing had been a terrible mistake. The campground wasn't really a campground at all. It was more like a clearing. A small, muddy patch hacked out of the woods, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to lean in, their needles sighing in the wind like whispered warnings. There was a rickety picnic table, half rotted, and a fire pit choked with damp leaves. No other RVs, no people, no sign of civilization whatsoever. Just us, the trees, and a silence so thick it pressed against your eardrums. "Well, this is rustic," Emily said, trying to sound upbeat, but her voice wavered slightly. Sarah was silent, her eyes wide as she stared out the RV window at the gloom closing in. Even she looked like she was second-guessing this adventure. I forced a chuckle. Rustic is one word for it. Isolated is another. Let's just get parked before it gets completely dark. Maneuvering the RV into the clearing was a pain. Branches scraped, mud splattered, and the engine whined in protest. Finally, with a lurch, we were parked. I killed the engine, and the silence descended again, heavier this time, broken only by the rustling pines and the frantic thump of my own heart. We got out of the RV, stretching our legs and trying to pretend we weren't all feeling a little unnerved. The air was cold biting and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The shadows were long and distorted, playing tricks on your eyes. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made you jump. "Okay," I said, clapping my hands together, maybe a little too loudly. "Let's get set up." "Firewood, Sarah. You're the fire starter in the family." Sarah nodded, her usual enthusiasm muted. She and Emily started gathering fallen branches, their movements jerky like startled deer. I busied myself with the RV's hookups, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind off the oppressive atmosphere. As darkness deepened, the woods around us seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, whistling through the pines, turning their sighing into something that sounded almost like voices. Whispering. Just at the edge of hearing, murmuring things you couldn't quite make out. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, just the trees. But the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Sarah finally got a fire going, a small, sputtering flame that cast flickering shadows across our faces. The firelight pushed back the darkness a little, but it also seemed to deepen the shadows beyond, making the trees look even taller, more menacing. We huddled around the fire, eating the sandwiches we'd packed, the silence punctuated by the crackling flames and the unsettling whispers of the wind. No one said much. Emily kept glancing nervously into the woods, and Sarah just stared into the fire, her usual spark completely extinguished. "So," I said finally, trying to break the tension. "Cozy, right?" Emily managed a weak smile. Sarah just shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around her. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered suddenly, her eyes wide again. "Hear what?" I asked, straining my ears. "Just the wind, the fire." "No," she said, her voice barely above a breath. Thek, it sounded like chanting. Sarah and I both froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind and the fire. Then, faintly carried on the breeze, I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, like voices murmuring in unison, too distant to make out words, but undeniably chanting. It seemed to come from deeper in the woods, from the direction the track had led us. My blood ran cold. Chant out here. In the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. It had to be some kind of animal, right? Some weird bird call or something. But it sounded too organized, too human. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, trying to sound reassuring, even though I didn't believe it myself. Maybe some teenagers camping further in. Emily shook her head, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "Doesn't sound like kids, Jake." The chanting continued, a low, unsettling drone that seemed to vibrate in the air, in our bones. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and the chanting pulsed, a dark, rhythmic heartbeat in the heart of the woods. Suddenly, Nebraska didn't seem so peaceful anymore. It felt ancient, and something ancient was definitely whispering in the pines. The chanting went on for what felt like hours, a low, throbbing pulse that burrowed into your skull. We huddled closer to the fire, The flickering flames our only comfort against the encroaching darkness and the unsettling sounds from the woods. No one dared to speak, each of us lost in our own growing dread. Even Sarah, the eternal optimist, looked utterly terrified. Finally, as abruptly as it began, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, a heavy, expectant stillness that felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The wind seemed to die down, the fire crackled weakly, and the only sound was the frantic pounding of my heart. "Okay," I said, my voice hoarse, breaking the silence. "Okay, that's enough nature for one night. Let's get inside." We scrambled into the RV, locking the door behind us like it was some flimsy barrier against whatever was out there. Inside, the RV felt small, cramped, but blessedly solid compared to the whispering woods. We drew the curtains, shutting out the darkness, and turned on all the lights, bathing the interior in a harsh, artificial glow. Emily made instant coffee, her hands shaking so badly she nearly spilled it. Sarah just sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly ahead. I tried to be the rational one, the engineer, the problem solver. It was probably just some kind of religious group, I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. Some rural church service or something, out in the woods for reasons. Emily snorted, taking a shaky sip of coffee. "Jake, be serious. That didn't sound like any church service I've ever heard. And out here, in the middle of nowhere. Maybe a cult." Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Cult. The word fit the feeling, the chanting, the isolation, the oppressive atmosphere of the woods. It was ridiculous, of course. Cults weren't real, not in Nebraska, not in the 21st century. But out here in this suffocating darkness, surrounded by whispering pines and unsettling chants, reality felt different, thinner, like something else could seep through. We tried to sleep, but it was useless. Every creak of the RV, every rustle outside made us jump. I kept imagining eyes watching us from the trees, unseen faces peering through the darkness. I barely dozed, and when I did, I dreamt of shadows moving in the woods, of whispers turning into screams. Morning finally came, pale and weak, filtering through the pine needles. The woods looked different in the daylight. Still imposing, still silent, but somehow less menacing. The fire had burned down to embers, and a thick layer of mist clung to the ground, giving everything a ghostly, unreal quality. We got out of the RV, stiff and exhausted, the cold morning air stinging our lungs. The chanting was gone, the woods silent except for the usual morning bird sounds, but the oppressive feeling lingered, a heavy weight in the air. "Okay," I said, trying to sound decisive. "Okay, new plan. We are not staying here another night. We pack up, we find a real campground with people, with electricity hookups that actually work." "Deal." Emily and Sarah nodded, relief flooding their faces. We started packing up, moving quickly, efficiently, like we were trying to outrun something. We disconnected the RV, stowed the gear, and I started the engine, the roar echoing loudly in the morning stillness. As I was about to pull away, Sarah suddenly gasped, pointing towards the woods. "Jakey, look." I followed her gaze. There, at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line, something was hanging from a low branch. At first, I thought it was some kind of decoration, some weird, twisted piece of wood, but as we got closer, my blood turned to ice. It was a doll, a crudely made doll, fashioned from sticks and rags, its face a grotesque mask of stitched on buttons and twigs. And it was hanging by its neck from a piece of twine, swaying gently in the morning breeze. It wasn't just hanging there either. Someone had placed it so it was facing the RV, its button eyes staring directly at us. Sarah whimpered, stepping back. Emily swore under her breath. I just stared, my mind blank with horror. This wasn't just some creepy decoration. This was a warning, a message. And the message was clear: you are not welcome here. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the RV into gear, tires spinning in the mud, and we lurched forward, away from the clearing, away from the woods, away from whispering pines. I didn't stop driving until we were back on the paved road, miles away from that cursed place, the rearview mirror showing nothing but empty highway stretching out behind us. We never went camping in Nebraska again. In fact, we sold the RV as soon as we got back to Chicago. Sarah still has nightmares sometimes. Whispers in her sleep about chanting and dolls with button eyes. Emily pretends it never happened, but I see the way she flinches at sudden noises. The way she avoids talking about Nebraska altogether. As for me, I try to forget. I try to tell myself it was just the wind, just the trees, just our imaginations running wild in the dark. But sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. A faint, low chanting carried on the wind. And I know deep down that whatever was whispering in whispering pines, whatever left that doll for use, it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes I think it's whispering my name. The RV camping trip in Nebraska was supposed to be a relaxing escape. Instead, it was a deadly mistake. And I fear it's a mistake we'll be paying for a long, long time. Story 2, my name is Ethan Blake, and I guess you could say I'm a bit of a wanderer at heart. Turning 42 this year, and after spending most of my adult life glued to a desk in Chicago, crunching numbers for a soul-sucking finance firm, I decided I needed a change. A big one. My marriage had crumbled a year back. Let's just say spreadsheets and romance don't mix, and the city noise was starting to feel like it was physically crushing me. So, I did what any self-respecting, slightly lost American guy would do. I bought an RV. Not some fancy top-of-the-line behemoth, mind you. More like a vintage, slightly rusty, but charmingly retro-class C named the Wanderer. It was old, smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten dreams, but it was mine. And it was going to be my ticket to freedom. My plan was simple. Hit the open road, see some of this country I'd only ever glimpsed from airplane windows, and maybe, just maybe, find a little peace and quiet. Nebraska kept popping up in my searches for remote camping, stargazing, and places to get seriously lost. Valentine, Nebraska, specifically, sounded intriguing. The name itself had a lonely kind of poetry to it. I read about the vast, open skies, the rolling hills, and the Niobrara River. Seemed like the perfect place to disconnect and recharge. I stocked the Wanderer with enough supplies to last me a couple of weeks, canned goods, bottled water, camping gear, and my trusty old acoustic guitar for campfire serenades, mostly for myself. Let's be honest. I even packed a decent first aid kit, just in case my wilderness adventure turned less zen, and more emergency room. The drive from Chicago to Valentine was long, mind-numbingly long. Illinois blurred into Iowa, Iowa into Nebraska, and the landscape slowly transformed from flat farmland to a more rugged, windswept terrain. As I got closer to Valentine, the towns got smaller, the spaces between them wider, and the feeling of isolation began to creep in. It wasn't unpleasant, not at first. It was the kind of solitude I was craving. I arrived in the late afternoon, the Nebraska sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was dry and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and something else's something earthy, and almost metallic. I couldn't quite place it. I found the designated campsite just outside Valentine Woods. A clearing marked with a weathered wooden sign looked like it hadn't been updated since the Nixon era. Valentine Woods Public Camping Area. It declared in faded green letters. The woods themselves loomed behind the clearing, a dense wall of dark pines that seemed to swallow the fading sunlight. They were silent, eerily so, especially compared to the constant hum of traffic I was used to. I parked the Wanderer, the gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out, stretching my stiff limbs. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. It was peaceful, yes, but also watchful. As I started setting up camp, unrolling the awning and getting the generator going, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It wasn't a threatening feeling, not exactly, but unsettling. Like something was out there, just beyond the tree lane, its eyes on me. I glanced into the woods a few times, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a curious coyote, but there was nothing. Just the deepening shadows and the rustle of wind through the pines. Later, as darkness fell and I sat by a small campfire, nursing a lukewarm can of chili, the woods really came alive. Not with the cheerful chirping of crickets or the hooting of owls like I expected. Instead, it was a different kind of life. Low rustling sounds, branches snapping in the distance, and something else, a soft, rhythmic thumping that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was faint, almost subliminal, but it was there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe. The wind, my own overactive imagination, but as the fire crackled and the darkness deepened, swallowing the clearing in its inky embrace, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was making that sound wasn't natural. And it was getting closer. Sleep didn't come easy that first night. Every rustle of leaves, Every snap of a twig jolted me awake. The rhythmic thumping persisted, sometimes fading into the background, then returning louder, closer. It was like a heartbeat, slow and heavy, emanating from the woods themselves. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, city, boy jitters in the face of true wilderness. But deep down, a cold knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake again by a sound that was definitely not my imagination. A whisper. Faint, breathy, just at the edge of hearing, but undeniably there. It seemed to come from just outside the wanderer, from the direction of the woods. I held my breath, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. Silence. Then another whisper, closer this time, like someone was right outside the RV, murmuring just beyond the thin metal wall. I scrambled out of bed, adrenaline surging. Peeking through the curtains of the RV window, I saw nothing but darkness and the flickering embers of the dying campfire. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the night breeze. No sign of anyone, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched, amplified tenfold. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding weak and shaky in the vast emptiness. Silence answered me. Only the whisper of the wind through the pines, which now seemed to carry a sinister undertone. I grabbed my flashlight, a heavy maglite I'd packed for emergencies, and cautiously opened the RV door. The night air was cold and damp, clinging to my skin like a shroud. The campfire was reduced to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I swept the flashlight beam around the clearing, illuminating the trees, the underbrush, the empty space where my picnic table stood. Nothing. Just the woods silent and watchful. "Is anyone there?" I called again, louder this time, my voice echoing into the darkness. Still nothing. Just the rustling leaves and that faint, rhythmic thumping, now seeming to come from deeper within the woods. The whispers were gone for now, but the feeling of dread remained, a heavy weight pressing down on me. I spent the rest of the night huddled inside the Wanderer, doors locked, curtains drawn, flashlight clutched in my hand. Every creak of the RV, every rustle outside, sent a jolt of fear through me. Sleep was impossible. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky a pale gray, I finally started to feel a sliver of relief. Daylight, I thought, would chase away the shadows and the whispers. But the morning brought no relief, only a different kind of unease. The woods in daylight were still silent, unnaturally so. No bird song, no squirrels chattering, no sounds of wildlife at all. Just the sighing of the wind through the pines and that persistent, rhythmic thumping, now fainter, but still there, constant, unsettling presence. I decided to explore the immediate area, hoping to find some rational explanation for the sounds and the whispers. Maybe there was a stream nearby causing the thumping, or some kind of strange echo effect in the woods amplifying the wind into whispers. I grabbed my hiking boots and a water bottle, leaving the Wanderer locked and secure, and ventured into Valentine Woods. The woods were dense, the pine trees growing close together, their needles carpeting the ground in a thick, springy layer. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. It was beautiful in a way, but also oppressive. As I walked deeper, the silence intensified. It was a silence that felt alive, expectant, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. The rhythmic thumping grew fainter as I moved away from the campsite, but the whispers returned, now seemingly coming from all around me, carried on the wind, rustling in the leaves. They were indistinct, just murmurs and sighs, too faint to make out any words. But they sounded sorrowful, like someone weeping just beyond the edge of hearing. It was deeply unsettling, this chorus of invisible mourners surrounding me in the silent woods. Then I saw it. Scratched into the bark of a large pine tree, near the base, barely visible beneath a layer of moss, was a symbol. A crude drawing etched into the wood of a stick figure with long hair, its arms outstretched, and a circle above its head. Underneath the figure, scratched even fainter, were 2 words. Evelyn weeps. A chill ran down my spine, cold in the damp morning air. Evelyn. The name from the sign. The whispers. The sorrowful sounds. It was all starting to connect, forming a picture that was far from comforting. I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn back, to get out into the woods, to drive the Wanderer as far away from Valentine as possible. But curiosity, That dangerous human trait held me rooted to the spot. Evelyn, who was she? And why did the woods weep for her? And what was that rhythmic thumping, that constant, unsettling heartbeat that seemed to pulse from the very heart of Valentine Woods? I had to know. I had to find out, even if it was a deadly mistake. Ignoring the primal urge to flee, I pushed deeper into the woods. The image of the scratched symbol and the name Evelyn burned into my mind. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like unseen voices, and the rhythmic thumping grew stronger, resonating in my chest now, a palpable vibration in the very air. It felt less like a sound and more like a presence, a heavy, oppressive pulse emanating from the woods themselves. I followed a faint game trail, pushing through thick undergrowth, the silence broken only by the crunch of my boots on pine needles and the increasingly insistent whispers and thumping. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees growing taller, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out even more of the already weak sunlight. The air grew colder, damper, and the metallic scent from the previous day intensified, now tinged with something else's, something sickly sweet and faintly rotten. Then I saw it again. Another symbol, scratched in a fallen log, identical to the first. Evelyn weeps, and then another on a moss-covered rock, and another on the trunk of a gnarled oak. They were everywhere, these crude symbols and mournful words, like breadcrumbs leading me deeper and deeper into the heart of Valentine Woods. Each one seemed to amplify the feeling of dread, the sense of being drawn towards something ancient and malevolent. The game trail led me to a small clearing, a place where the trees thinned slightly, allowing a weak shaft of sunlight to penetrate the canopy. In the center of the clearing, something glinted in the dim light. As I approached, I saw it was a small, tarnished silver locket, lying half buried in the pine needles. It was heart-shaped, intricately engraved with floral patterns, and slightly ajar. Hesitantly, I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. It felt strangely heavy, heavier than it should have been. I flipped it open. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a miniature photograph. A black and white image of a young woman with long dark hair and hauntingly sad eyes. She wore a simple dress, and a faint, melancholic smile touched her lips. On the back of the photograph, in delicate cursive script, was a single word, Evelyn. My breath caught in my throat. This was her. Evelyn, the weeping woman of the woods. The source of the whispers, the symbols, the oppressive dread. But who was she? And why was her sorrow so palpable, so pervasive in these woods? As I stared at the photograph, the rhythmic thumping intensified again, becoming almost deafening, vibrating through my bones now. The whispers coalesced, no longer in distinct murmurs, but forming words, broken, sorrowful words that seemed to echo in my mind, not in my ears. Lost child gone, taken, weeps. The words resonated with a pain so profound, so visceral, it felt like a physical blow. I stumbled back, dropping the locket as if it had burned my hand. The clearing seemed to darken, the air growing colder still, and the trees around me seemed to sway and writhe, even though there was no wind. Then I saw her. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. A figure in a pale, flowing dress, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Evelyn, the ghost of Valentine Woods. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. Her presence radiating an unbearable sorrow, a palpable grief that seemed to seep into the very ground beneath my feet. The whispers intensified, swirling around her, around me. A chorus of mournful cries, and the rhythmic thumping, it was coming from her now, from the figure in the pale dress, a slow, heavy heartbeat of grief and despair. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. This was no ordinary woods, no ordinary camping trip. This was something ancient, something haunted, something deeply, profoundly wrong. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had stumbled into something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't escape. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Evelyn began to move. She glided into the clearing, her pale form shimmering in the dim light, her head still bowed, her long hair trailing behind her like a shroud. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, faster, pounding in my ears, in my chest, in my very soul. The whispers became screams, silent screams that tore through my mind, filled with unbearable anguish and loss. She stopped a few feet from me, still not looking up. The air around her shimmered and distorted, and the sickly sweet, rotten scent intensified, making my stomach churn. I could feel a coldness radiating from her, a coldness that seeped into my bones, chilling me to the core. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, she raised her head. Her long hair fell away from her face, revealing nothing. Where her eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets, black voids that seemed to suck in all the light, all the hope, all the life around them. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to stretch and distort, pulling at the very fabric of reality. And from those empty sockets, from that gaping maw, the whispers poured forth. No longer sorrowful murmurs, but a torrent of anguish, of despair, of unimaginable loss. The rhythmic thumping reached a fever pitch, a frantic, desperate pounding that threatened to shatter my sanity. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the horror of Evelyn's gaze, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by the sheer weight of her sorrow. I could feel my own life force draining away, sucked into the void of her grief, becoming part of the weeping woods, part of her endless lament. The last thing I saw, before darkness claimed me completely, was Evelyn reaching out a pale, skeletal hand towards me, her empty sockets fixed on mine, the whispers turning into a single, chilling word, a word that echoed in the void as my consciousness faded away. Join. Whether I survived that night in Valentine Woods, I cannot say for sure. Sometimes when the silence is too deep, when the wind whispers just right, I still hear her voice, and I smell the damp earth and the sickly sweet scent of decay. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that a part of me is still there, lost in the weeping woods, forever bound to the sorrow of Evelyn. And sometimes, late at night, I feel a faint rhythmic thumping in my chest, a heartbeat that is not my own. The heartbeat of Valentine Woods. And I know, she is still weeping and waiting. Story 4, my name is Jake, and I guess you could say I was always a creature of comfort. Give me my couch, my video games, and a pizza, and I was a happy man. The great outdoors usually meant my backyard patio, and even that was pushing it. So, when my buddy Mark started going on and about this epic RV camping trip in Nebraska, I was less than thrilled. Dude, come on, it'll be awesome. Mark had said, practically vibrating with excitement. We'll rent an RV, hit up the Nebraska National Forest, cook over a campfire, see some real stars. Get off the grid for once, Jake. Mark was the opposite of me. He was all about adventure hiking, roughing it, the kind of guy who actually enjoyed mosquito bites and sleeping on the ground. He was also annoyingly persuasive, and truth be told, my life had been feeling stale. Same routine, same apartment, same takeout. Maybe a jolt of something different was what I needed. Plus, Mark promised to handle all the planning and driving. That was a big selling point. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. We roped in another friend, Sarah, who was somewhere in the middle of our comfort spectrum like nature, but also appreciated a hot shower. With the crew assembled, Mark booked us a weekend in late October. He'd found some perfect. Campsite deep in the Nebraska National Forest, near a place called Bessie Ranger District. Sounded remote, sounded rustic. Sounded like I'd be regretting this. The Friday morning we were supposed to leave dawned crisp and cold. I packed a duffel bag with the bare minimum clothes, toiletries, and a hefty supply of snacks at Priorities People. Mark picked me up in the rented RV to beast of a thing, way bigger than I imagined. It smelled faintly of pine cleaner and something vaguely musty. Sarah was already inside, looking far too cheerful for 8 a.m. on a Friday. Ready for adventure, boys, she chirped, adjusting her beanie. As I'll ever be, I mumbled, lugging my duffel inside. The RV was actually pretty decent. Small kitchen, tiny bathroom, a couple of bunks, and a dinette area. Mark was already in the driver's seat fiddling with the GPS. All right, destination Bessie Ranger District, Nebraska National Forest. He announced, putting the RV in gear. The adventure awaits. The drive was long, mind-numbingly long. Nebraska, as it turns out, is mostly just flat. Fields and fields of corn stalks, fading into the horizon under a vast, pale sky. We passed through small towns that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s, diners with neon signs, and gas stations that seemed to be the only signs of life for miles. Mark and Sarah chatted excitedly about hiking trails and campfire stories, while I mostly stared out the window, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. It wasn't just the boredom of the drive. There was something about the landscape, the sheer emptiness, that felt oppressive. As we got closer to the national forest, the The terrain started to change. The cornfields gave way to rolling hills and then, finally, to trees. Not the lush green forest I was used to, but something sparser, more brittle. The air grew colder, the sky a heavy, overcast gray. The GPS led us down increasingly narrow roads and onto a gravel track that rattled the RV like a tin can. Almost there, Mark declared, grinning. See, told you it was remote. He wasn't kidding. We pulled into a clearing that barely qualified as a campsite. A fire pit ringed with stones, a picnic table that looked like it had seen better decades. And that was it. No other campers, no ranger station in sight, just trees. Lots and lots of trees, stretching in every direction, their branches bare and skeletal against the darkening sky. A shiver went down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. This place, it felt different, isolated, too quiet. Well, this is rustic, Sarah said, trying to sound enthusiastic, but I could hear a slight tremor in her voice. Mark, oblivious as ever, was already hopping out of the RV, practically bouncing with energy. All right, let's set up camp. Firewood needs gathering. Tent needs pitching. Jake, you want to help me with the fire pit? I reluctantly climbed out of the RV, the cold air biting at my face. As I followed Mark towards the fire pit, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence of the forest wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. Like something was holding its breath, waiting. We started gathering deadwood, the silence broken only by the snap of branches and the rustle of leaves underfoot. The shadows were getting long, the light fading fast. The air grew colder still, and a wind started to whisper through the trees, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry secrets I didn't want to hear. Mark was humming to himself, completely unfazed. Sarah was unpacking supplies from the RV, her movements a little quicker than usual. Me. I was just trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that was settling in my bones. This camping trip had already felt like a mistake, and I had a feeling it was about to get a whole lot worse. The fire was Mark's domain. He was a pyromaniac in the best possible way, always able to coax flames from the most stubborn twigs. Soon a crackling fire was blazing in the pit, casting flickering orange light against the encroaching darkness. The warmth was welcome, but it did little to the icy knot in my stomach. Sarah had managed to make the RV feel a little less sterile, unpacking blankets and stringing up fairy lights inside. We huddled around the dinette table, eating lukewarm chili from cans and trying to pretend everything was normal. See, isn't this better than sitting at home watching TV? Mark asked, grinning around a mouthful of chili. Debatable, I muttered, picking at my food. Sarah shot me a warning glance. I knew I was being a downer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. "It'll be great tomorrow," said brightly. "We'll hike, explore, maybe even see some wildlife." "Yeah, maybe we'll spot Bigfoot," I said sarcastically. Mark actually perked up at that. "Hey, you never know. This place feels wild, you know. Like anything could be out there." He said it with a thrill in his voice, but I just felt a fresh wave of unease. Anything could be out there. That was exactly what worried me. As the evening wore on, the temperature plummeted. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing into the black sky. The wind picked up, sighing through the pines, sounding less like whispers now and more like moans. Every shadow seemed to deepen to reddy. I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, convinced I was seeing movement at the edge of my vision. "Anyone else feeling cold?" Sarah asked, pulling her jacket tighter. Even Mark seemed a little less enthusiastic, his usual boisterousness dampened by the oppressive atmosphere. "Yeah, it's getting pretty chilly," he admitted, tossing another log on the fire. "Maybe we should call it a night soon." That sounded like the best idea I'd heard all day. We retreated into the RV, the flimsy door feeling like a pathetic barrier against whatever might be lurking outside. Sarah and I took the bunks in the back, while Mark claimed the convertible dinette bed. We turned off the RV lights, plunging us into near total darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the dying embers outside. The wind howled around the RV, rattling the windows and making the whole vehicle shudder. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. It was a symphony of unsettling sounds, designed to keep you awake and on edge. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle, every snap of a twig outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I lay rigid in my bunk, listening. straining to hear over the wind. I imagined eyes watching us from the darkness, unseen things moving just beyond the firelight. Suddenly, a sound cut through the wind, a low, guttural growl. It was close, chillingly close, right outside the RV. My heart leaped into my throat. I held my breath, listening, every nerve screaming. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a heavy thud against the side of the RV. The whole vehicle rocked. Sarah gasped in the bunk above me. Even Mark, who usually slept through anything, stirred in his bed. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know," Mark stammered, sitting up. "Maybe an animal, a bear. A bear, maybe." But this didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more menacing, laced with something unnatural. Another thud, harder this time, against the back of the RV, right near our bunks. The metal groaned and vibrated. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through beer. This wasn't just a beer. This was something else. "Mark, get the flashlight." I hissed, scrambling to sit up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the edge of the bunk. Mark fumbled for the flashlight, his hands trembling too. He switched it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness inside the RV. We stared at each other, our faces pale and etched with fear. Okay. Let's just take a look," Mark said, trying to sound braver than he looked. He slowly moved towards the RV door, flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of him. He reached for the door handle, his hand hovering over it, hesitating. The wind howled again, and another growl, closer than ever, echoed outside. The RV shuddered again, this time from the front. Something was circling us. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes wide with terror. He turned to us, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe we should just stay inside. Wait until morning. Stay inside. Trapped in this metal box, surrounded by whatever was out there. The thought was terrifying, but so was the idea of opening that door. We were trapped, and whatever was outside, it was getting closer. Staying inside felt like hiding in a coffin, but the thought of opening that door was even worse. We huddled together in the dim RV interior, listened to the sounds outside. The growling continued, circling the RV, punctuated by heavy thuds and scrapes against the metal siding. It was relentless, like whatever it wasn't going to give up. Hours crawled by. Sleep was a distant memory. We sat in petrified silence, broken only by the wind, the fire's dying embers, and the terrifying sounds surrounding us. Mark kept the flashlight trained on the door, his face pale and sweating even in the cold. Sarah was curled up in her bunk, her eyes wide and unblinking, tears silently streaming down her face. I felt numb beyond fear now, just a hollow atch in my chest. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the sky a bruised purple, the sounds outside intensified. The growling turned into snarls. The thuds became violent slams, shaking the RV violently. It felt like whatever was out there was losing patience. Suddenly, a new sound pierced through the cacophony, a high-pitched, keening wail. It was inhuman, utterly chilling, and it resonated deep in my bones, making my teeth ache. Sarah let out a strangled sob and buried her face in her hands. Even Mark flinched, his bravado finally cracking. What is that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I had no answer. It sounded like pain, like rage, like something ancient and monstrous unleashed. The wail rose and pitched, becoming deafening, and the RV began to rock violently from side to side. We were being shaken, tossed around like toys. Then, with a sickening crunch of metal, the RV door ripped open. The flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating the gaping doorway. Standing there, silhouetted against the pale dawn light, was something. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form gaunt and skeletal, draped in rags that seemed to writhe in the wind. Its head was hidden in shadow, but I could see 2 points of light burning like embers where its eyes should be. The keening wail stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, rasping breath that seemed to fill the RV. The air grew instantly colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my marrow. The smell hit me then, a stench of rotten decay, like something long dead and buried dragged back into the light. Terror, raw and primal, flooded my senses. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't human. This was something else. Something ancient and evil, something that had no place in the waking world. The figure took a step forward, its long, skeletal fingers twitching. Mark screamed, a raw animal sound, and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Darkness engulfed the RV again, broken only by the burning embers of those eyes in the doorway. I don't remember thinking, I just reacted. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the fear. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a heavy cast iron skillet Sarah had used for cooking, and hurled myself forward, screaming a wordless cry of defiance. The skillet connected with something solid, bone hard, and the figure recoiled with a hiss. It stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the unexpected attack. That was all the opening we needed. Run, I screamed, shoving Sarah towards the back door of the RV. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror, and we stumbled blindly towards the rear exit. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers numb with cold and fear, finally managing to wrench it open. We plunged out of the RV and into the pre-dawn gloom. The figure roaring behind us, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. We didn't look back. We just ran. We ran through the trees, branches whipping at our faces, thorns tearing at our clothes. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs screamed, until the RV and the monstrous figure were lost behind us. We ran until we collapsed, gasping for breath, in a small clearing. The first rays of sunrise filtering through the trees. We were alive, for now. But we were lost deep in the Nebraska National Forest, with no RV, no supplies, and no idea what was hunting us. And as I look back at the dark line of trees we'd just fled from, I knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever we had encountered in that campsite, it wasn't done with us yet. Our RV camping trip in Nebraska had been a deadly mistake, and the nightmare was just beginning. Story 5, my name is Jake, and if you're reading this, maybe you're thinking about taking that RV trip to Nebraska. Maybe you saw the brochures, the glossy pictures of wide open skies and endless horizons. Let me tell you something, burn those brochures. Toss them in the fire pit you were probably planning to use, because the only thing you'll be roasting in Nebraska is your sanity. I'm not some adrenaline junkie or a thrill seeker. I'm just regular. 30-something accountant by day, craft beer enthusiast by night. My idea of roughing it used to be forgetting to order extra napkins with my takeout. But Sarah, my girlfriend, she's different. Sarah's got this wanderlust thing, always scrolling through Instagram, pinning pictures of sunsets over mountain ranges and couples laughing around campfires. This Nebraska RV trip, yeah, that was Sarah's idea. It'll be romantic, Jake. Think about it, just us, the open road, and Nebraska. She'd said it with this dreamy look in her eyes, like Nebraska was some kind of promised land of adventure. I'd raised an eyebrow. Nebraska. Wasn't that just flat? Cornfields. Cows. Sarah just waved her hand dismissively. There's more to it than you think. We can go to Toadstool Geological Park, Carhenge, and Chimney Rock. She trailed off a little, enthusiasm wavering slightly as she listed the attractions. Even she knew Nebraska wasn't exactly Yosemite. But I love Sarah, and honestly, the idea of getting away from spreadsheets and tax forms for a week wasn't entirely unappealing. So, I agreed. We rented a Class C RV, the C, standing for claustrophobic. I'm pretty sure packed enough snacks to survive a nuclear winter, and set off. We planned a route that snaked through the western part of the state, hitting all the must-see spots Sarah had meticulously researched online. The first day was fine. Long stretches of highway, yes, lots of corn, yes, but the sunsets were actually pretty impressive. We stopped at roadside diners with names like Mema's Kitchen and Die Chuckwag and a Grazy Burgers and drank lukewarm coffee. It was quaint. Sarah was happy, snapping pictures of everything, narrating our adventure for a non-existent YouTube channel. I even started to relax a little. Maybe Nebraska wasn't so bad after all. We decided to camp at a state park in the northwest near the Black Hills. Sarah had found it online, Panhandle Paradise RV Park, the website boasted, with pictures of sparkling lakes and towering pine trees. Paradise. Right as we drove deeper to the park, the paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt. The sparkling lake looked more like a murky pond, and the towering pine trees were, well, they were there, but they seemed to lean in, casting long, skeletal shadows across the already dimming landscape. The RV park itself was deserted. One rusty sign, half hidden by weeds, pointed to a loop of campsites, most of them overgrown and clearly unused for years. There was one other RV parkway down the loop, looking like it had been there since the Reagan administration. No people, no park rangers, just us in the unsettling silence. Cozy, Sarah said, trying to sound upbeat, but even her voice had a nervous tremor. We parked in a relatively clear spot, the RV groaning as it leveled itself on the uneven ground. As I stepped out, a gust of wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite place, something like damp earth and something else. Something metallic, almost like blood. I shook my head, dismissing it. Probably just my imagination running wild. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. Nebraska paradise. Yeah, right? This was just the beginning of our deadly mistake. We tried to make the best of it. Set up the camping chairs, wrestled with the bulky awning, and even managed to get a fire going in the rusty fire pit. The wood was damp and smoky, but the flames eventually caught, casting flickering shadows that danced with the swaying pines. Sarah, ever the optimist, pulled out a portable speaker and started playing some mellow acoustic music. It was supposed to be relaxing, but out here, in this desolate place, even Ed Sheeran sounded ominous. As dusk deepened into full night, the silence became heavier, almost suffocating. The wind still whispered through the trees, but now it sounded less like wind and more like sighing. Long, drawn-out sighs, like the forest itself was weary and burdened. The shadows grew longer and darker, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous figures in the periphery of the firelight. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made me jump. "Relax, Jake," Sarah said, noticing my jumpiness. "It's just animals. Probably deer or I don't know, prairie dogs." She sounded less sure of herself than she wanted to. Even Sarah, the eternal optimist, was starting to feel at the wrongness of this place. We ate dinner foil, packet meals heated over the fire, and tried to make conversation, but it felt forced. The silence kept creeping back in, punctuated by the crackling fire and those unsettling sighs of the wind. I kept glancing towards the edge of the woods, where the darkness seemed to press in, thick and impenetrable. It felt like something was watching us from out there, unseen, unheard, but present. After dinner, Sarah wanted to stargaze. Nebraska skis, she'd read, were supposed to be incredible for stargazing far from city lights. And she was right, the sky was a velvet black canvas, dusted with a million brilliant points of light. It was beautiful, breathtaking even. But even the beauty felt tainted out here. Too vast, too empty, too indifferent to her smallness. As we sat there, wrapped in blankets, staring up at the cosmos, I heard it. A sound that wasn't the wind, wasn't an animal. It was faint, at first barely audible over the crackling fire. A rhythmic thumping. Distant, but distinct. Thump, 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 I held my breath, straining to hear. "Sarah, do you hear that?" I whispered, nudging her arm. She frowned, tilting her head. "Hear what?" "The crickets. Know that thumping sound, like a drum." She listened for a moment longer, then shook her head. "I don't hear anything, Jake. You're just spooked." Maybe she was right. Maybe it was just my nerves. But I kept listening, and the thumping continued, faint but persistent, a slow, steady rhythm echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. Thump, 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 it seemed to be getting closer. We went to bed early, retreating into the cramped confines of the RV. Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and the day. But I lay awake staring at the ceiling vent, listening to the wind, listening for the thumping. It was still there. Thump, 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 a slow, deliberate beat that resonated in my chest, filling me with a growing unease. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak, orange glows on the surrounding trees. The wind had picked up, howling now, no longer sighing, but moaning like something in pain. And the thumping, it was louder now, closer. TMP, GMP, a TUMP, it was definitely getting closer. And then I heard another sound. Not the wind, not the fire, not the thumping. This sound was inside the RV, a soft scratching, like fingernails on thin metal. Scritch, scritch, scritch coming from the roof. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held my breath, listening, every nerve ending screaming. Scritch, scritch, scrit, the scratching moved, sliding across the metal roof, circling the RV. It was slow, deliberate, like something was exploring, investigating. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, it was more terrifying than any sound. I lay frozen, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening, waiting. And then, right above my head, directly above the bed, I heard it. A soft whisper. Just one word. breathed so softly, so intimately it felt like it was spoken directly into my ear, even though Sarah was sleeping soundly beside me. The whisper said, "Jake." And that's when I knew, with a cold certainty that seeped into my bones, that we had made a deadly mistake coming to Nebraska. We weren't alone in this paradise, and whatever was out there knew my name. My blood ran ice cold. Jake. The whisper echoed in the small space of the RV, a sound that shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there. Sarah stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep, oblivious. I lay rigid, every muscle clenched, listening for any repeat of that chilling sound. Silence again, except for the howling wind in the distant, relentless thump, thump, thump. I had to wake Sarah. I nudged her gently, then a little harder. Sarah, wake up." She groaned and rolled over, blinking sleepily. "What is it, Jake?" "It's the middle of the night." Do you hear anything just now?" I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. She frowned, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what? Just the wind?" "I guess. No, before that, a whisper." "Did you hear someone say my name?" Sarah stared at me, her eyes widening slowly as she registered the fear in my voice. "Jake, what are you talking about? There's no one out here. It's just us." "But I heard it, Sarah. I swear I did. Someone whispered my name right above us on the roof." She sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fear was in her eyes now too, mirroring my own. Okay, maybe it was the wind playing tricks. Or an animal. Maybe a raccoon or something. Her voice was shaky, unconvincing even to herself. I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too knowing. And that whisper, it had sounded personal. "I don't think so, Sarah," I said, slowly getting out of bed. I think we should check outside." "Are you crazy?" "Jake, no. We should stay inside, lock the doors. If there's something out there, we don't want to go out." "But what if it's trying to get in?" I countered, my voice rising in panic. "That scratching?" The whisper, "What if it's not going to leave us alone?" Sarah hesitated, fear warring with her practical side. Finally, she nodded, her face pale. Okay, but we're going together, and we're taking the flashlight." I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the bedside table, the beam cutting a weak swath through the darkness inside the RV. We unlocked the door slowly, cautiously, every creak of the hinges sounding deafening in the silence. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The night air hit us like a slap in the face, cold and sharp. The wind howled louder now, whipping through the pines, and the thump, thump, thump was definitely closer, resonating from the woods just beyond our campsite. I swept the flashlight beam around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing, just trees, shadows, the flickering embers of the fire pit. The RV roof was bare. No sign of anything. For a moment, I almost dared to hope it had been my imagination, a nightmare brought on by too much gas station coffee and campfire chili. See. "Nothing," Sarah whispered, relief flickering in her eyes. "It was just your nerves, Jake." But I wasn't convinced. I kept the flashlight beam moving, scanning the darkness, my senses on high alert. And then I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, just where the shadows deepened into absolute black, a pair of eyes. Not animal eyes, not reflecting the flashlight beam with that familiar green or yellow glint. These eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark, reflecting back no light at all, just blackness. Empty, bottomless blackness. And they were watching us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Sarah, look." I pointed the flashlight, my hand shaking so badly the beam danced wildly. Sarah followed my gaze, and then she gasped a choked, terrified sound. The eyes were still there, unblinking, unwavering, fixed on us from the darkness. And slowly, impossibly, a shape began to coalesce around them, emerging from the shadows. It was humanoid. Tall gone, its limbs too long, too thin. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet with tangled strings. And as it stepped further into the firelight, I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of it. Where a face should have been, there was just blankness. A smooth, featureless expanse of skin, like a mannequin's head, but somehow organic. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just nothing. Except for those two black pits that burned in the darkness where eyes should be. It was the thing that had whispered my name. The thing that had been scratching on the roof. The thing that had been watching us from the shadows. The thing that was now stepping into the firelight, its blank face turned towards us. and I knew with a terror that paralyzed me that it was coming for us. Sarah screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure horror. She stumbled back, tripping over the camping chairs, falling to the ground. I wanted to run, to grab her and drag her back into the RV, to lock the door and pray, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot, staring at the approaching figure. It moved closer, its jerky gait somehow quickening, its long, thin limbs eating up the distance between us. The thump, 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 thump was deafening now, vibrating through the ground, through my bones. It wasn't a drum. It was footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps, coming from the thing with no face. It reached the edge of the firelight and stopped. It stood there, silhouetted against the flames, its blank face turned towards us, those black eyes burning into my soul. And then it did something that broke the last vestiges of my sanity. It tilted its head slightly, and from that featureless expanse of skin, a mouth began to form. Not a normal mouth, but a jagged, tearing gash that ripped open in the smooth skin, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. And from that newly formed mouth, it spoke. Its voice was a distorted, echoing mockery of my own. It spoke my name again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a growl, a guttural, hungry sound that resonated with pure malice. "Jake," it said, its voice my voice, but twisted, corrupted. "It's time to come home." And then it lunged. I finally moved, adrenaline flooding my system, snapping me out of my paralysis. I didn't run into the RV. I didn't try to fight. I just reacted instinctively, desperately. I swung the heavy flashlight, aiming for those black eyes, for that blank, horrifying face. The flashlight connected with a sickening thud. The thing recoiled, hissing, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. It stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the flashlight beam. That was my chance. I grabbed Sarah, hauling her to her feet, ignoring her whimpers of terror. "Run, Sarah, run." We ran. We ran blindly, desperately, away from the campsite, away from the firelight into the suffocating darkness of the pines. The wind screamed around us, the trees clawed at us, and behind us I could hear it. Thump, 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 it was still coming. It was still hunting us, and I knew with chilling certainty that our RV camping trip in Nebraska had been a deadly, irreversible mistake. We had stumbled into something ancient, something hungry, something that knew our names and wanted use home. And home, in this Nebraska paradise, was a place we would never escape. Story 6, my name is Dale, and up until last summer, I considered myself a pretty rational guy, accountant by trade, predictable by nature. Thursdays were steak night, Saturdays were for college football, and vacations were meticulously planned spreadsheets of costs and itineraries. Spontaneity was something that happened to other people, preferably far away from me. So when my buddy Kevin suggested an RV camping trip to Nebraska, my first instinct was to politely decline and maybe suggest a nice, all-inclusive resort in Cancun instead. Kevin, however, is not easily deterred. He's the kind of friend who thrives on the unconventional, the impulsive, the downright reckless sometimes. "Dale, buddy," he'd said, leaning back in his chair at our usual Friday night poker game, a manic glint in his eye. "Nebraska. Wide open spaces, man. Think about it, just us, the open road, and Nebraska." He trailed off, as if Nebraska itself was a punchline and a promise all at once. Honestly, Nebraska wasn't exactly on my bucket list. My mental image of the state was mostly cornfields and, well, more cornfields. But Kevin painted a different picture. He talked about the vast, star-studded skies, the quiet solitude, the chance to unplug and really get away from the grind. He even dangled the carrot of legendary Nebraska steaks, which I'll admit did pique my interest. And then there was the RV. Kevin, in a fit of what I can only describe as midlife exuberance, had recently purchased a vintage, gloriously retro RV. He called it the Wanderer. It was all chrome trim and avocado green paint, straight out of the 70s. He envisioned us cruising across the plains in it, windows down, classic rock blaring, living the ultimate road trip fantasy. Against my better judgment, and after weeks of Kevin's relentless enthusiasm wearing me down, I agreed. I even started to get a little excited. Maybe a break from spreadsheets, and steak night was exactly what I needed. We planned for a week-long trip, mapping out a route that would take us through some of Nebraska's less traveled areas, promising state parks and hidden gem campsites. The morning we left, the air was thick with that late July humidity that clings to you like a second skin, Kevin arrived at my place in the Wanderer, grinning from ear to ear, the RV rumbling like a contented beast. He'd stocked it with enough snacks and drinks to survive a minor apocalypse, and the interior, while smelling faintly of mothballs and old vinyl, had a certain quirky charm. We hit the road around midday, leaving the familiar suburbs behind and heading west. The initial drive was, well, Nebraska. Cornfields, as predicted, stretched out on either side of the highway. An endless green sea under a vast blue sky. It was peaceful in a way. The kind of quiet that hums in your ears after too much city noise. As we ventured further from the interstate and onto state highways, and then eventually county roads, the landscape began to change. The cornfields thinned, replaced by rolling hills covered in tall grasses that swayed in the wind like golden waves. The towns became smaller, more spread out, each one a cluster of weathered buildings clinging to the side of the road. By late afternoon, we reached our first campsite, a state park nestled alongside a surprisingly pretty river. We set up camp, Kevin expertly maneuvering the Wanderer into a level spot while I wrestled with the awning. The air was cooler here, the shade of the trees a welcome respite from the sun. We grilled burgers, cracked open some beers, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was nice. Actually, really nice. Maybe Kevin was onto something after all. That night, the stars were incredible. Away from the city lights, the sky exploded with a million tiny diamonds scattered across black velvet. We sat outside by a crackling campfire, sharing stories and beers, the quiet broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Even Ranger, my usually anxious German shepherd, seemed relaxed, contentedly dozing at my feet. The next day was more of the same, driving through scenic backroads, hiking short trails, enjoying the quiet beauty of the Nebraska countryside. We stopped at a quirky roadside diner for lunch, filled with locals who eyed us with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Everything felt normal, pleasant, exactly the kind of low-key vacation I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't until the third day that things started to feel off. We were heading further west, deeper into the state, aiming for a more remote campsite Kevin had found online, promising unparalleled wilderness experience. As we drove, the landscape shifted again. The rolling hills gave way to a flatter, more desolate terrain. The trees became sparser, twisted and gnarled like skeletal fingers reaching out of the earth. The sky, once a bright, cheerful blue, turned a flat, pale gray, even though the sun was still shining. The air grew heavy, thick with a silence that was no longer peaceful but oppressive. Even the cicadas, which had been buzzing incessantly since we left, seemed to have fallen silent. Ranger, who had been happily sticking his head out the window, suddenly whined, pulling back and settling down at my feet, his ears drooping. "Something wrong, boy?" I asked, scratching him behind the ears. He just whined again, a low, uneasy sound. "Just getting into the real wilderness, Dale," Kevin said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Getting away from it all. Isn't this what you wanted?" I forced a smile. Yeah, it's great," I said, but even to my own ears, my voice sounded strained. We drove on, the landscape becoming increasingly unsettling. The trees were now mostly gone, replaced by scrub brush and dry, cracked earth. The sky remained stubbornly gray, casting a strange, muted light over everything. It felt like we were driving into a black and white photograph, all color and life slowly draining away. Then, the road started to change. It was paved at first, but gradually deteriorated, becoming cracked, potholed, then eventually just a rough gravel track. The Wanderer, bless its retro heart, bounced and rattled, protesting with every bump and rut. "You sure this is the right way, Kev?" I asked, checking the GPS on my phone. Of course, there was no signal. We were officially off the grid. Kevin just shrugged, his usual enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "According to the directions, yeah." Said it was a bit off the beaten path. Rustic charm, right? He tried to inject some cheer into his voice, but it sounded forced. The track wound through a landscape that was now utterly devoid of any charm, rustic or otherwise. It was desolate, barren, almost lunar. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of gravel into the RV's tires and the uneasy whine of Ranger at my feet. The air felt colder now, despite the summer heat, a damp, chilling cold that seeped into your bones. And then we saw it, ahead rising out of the flat, featureless landscape, a cluster of trees. Not the tall, majestic pines we'd seen earlier, but something different. They were twisted, contorted, their branches reaching up like clawing hands. They were dark, almost black against the gray sky, and they seemed to lean inwards, towards each other, as if huddling together for some unknown, sinister purpose. As we got closer, a sense of unease settled over me, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ranger started to growl, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floor of the RV. Even Kevin, usually unflappable, seemed to tense up, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Well," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful, "looks like we found our unparalleled wilderness experience." But as we pulled closer to the trees, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't wilderness. This was something else entirely. And whatever it was, it felt wrong. Terribly, profoundly wrong. And I had a very bad feeling that our RV camping trip in Nebraska was about to become a deadly mistake. We edged closer to the trees, the wanderer groaning in protest as the gravel track deteriorated further, becoming rutted and uneven. The cluster of trees loomed larger, and the closer we got, the more unnatural they seemed. Their trunks were thick and twisted, like arthritic limbs, and their branches, bare of leaves despite it being late July, reached skyward in grotesque shapes. The bark was a sickly gray color, almost like bone, and seemed strangely smooth, devoid of the usual rough texture of tree bark. As we finally pulled to a stop at the edge of the tree line, an almost palpable wave of cold washed over us. It was a dry, penetrating cold that felt like it was coming from the earth itself, chilling you from the inside out. The air, already heavy and still, seemed to thicken, becoming almost viscous, making it feel difficult to breathe. The silence was absolute now, a deafening void that pressed in on your ears, making them ring. Even Ranger, usually a vocal dog, was silent, hunkered down at my feet, trembling slightly. "Well, this is something," Kevin said, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. He switched off the engine, and the sudden absence of the RV's rumble made the silence even more profound, almost menacing. We sat there for a moment, staring at the trees, a growing unease tightening in my chest. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that went beyond just being remote or rustic. It felt tainted, corrupted, like stepping into a place where the natural laws of the world didn't quite apply. Maybe we should find another spot," I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. "This place feels, I don't know, creepy." Kevin hesitated, glancing around at the desolate landscape, then back at the trees. "Now, come on, Dale. We drove all this way. Let's just check it out. Maybe it's actually pretty cool once we get in there." He tried for his usual bravado, but it lacked conviction. I could see the apprehension in his eyes, the same cold dread I was feeling myself. Against my better instincts, I agreed. We were already here, after all. And Kevin, despite his sometimes reckless nature, wasn't completely stupid. If it really felt too wrong, we could always just pack up and leave. Right? We got out of the RV, the heavy silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. The ground underfoot was dry and cracked, littered with sharp, black stones that crunched ominously with every step. The air smelled strange, not like pine needles and damp earth like in the state park, but something else, something acrid and metallic, with a faint underlying sweetness that was strangely unsettling. As we walked towards the trees, Ranger stayed close, his body tense, his low growl rumbling in his chest again. The closer we got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The twisted trees loomed over us, their bare branches like skeletal arms reaching down. The ground under the trees was strangely bare, devoid of any undergrowth, just a layer of dry gray dust. We stepped into the treeland, and it was like crossing a threshold. The muted gray light outside was replaced by a deep, oppressive gloom. The air grew even colder, the silence even more absolute. It was like all sound, all light, all warmth was being sucked away by these trees, leaving behind only a hollow, empty void. "Okay," Kevin said, his voice tight. "Okay, maybe this is a little intense. But look, there's a clearing just ahead. Maybe we can set up camp there." He pointed through the twisted trunks to a slightly more open space a few yards deeper into the trees. We moved forward, the silence broken only by the crunch of our boots on the dry ground and Ranger's low growls. The clearing was small, ringed by the same grotesque trees, but it was slightly less claustrophobic than the deeper woods. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, a crude circle of blackened stones, hinting that someone, at some point, had camped here before, or something had. "See," Kevin said, trying to sound upbeat. "Perfect campsite. Fire pit already here. We're golden." He tried to smile, but it looked forced. Strained. We started to set up camp, moving in a kind of numb, automatic way. Kevin wrestled with the RV's leveling blocks, while I started gathering firewood dry, brittle branches that snapped easily in the unnatural silence. Even simple tasks felt heavy, burdened by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Ranger stayed close to me, constantly scanning the trees, his growls never quite ceasing. As I was arranging the firewood in the fire pit, I noticed something odd. The stones of the fire pit weren't just blackened by soot, they were marked. Scratched with strange symbols, lines, and angles that didn't look like random scratches. They looked deliberate, like some kind of writing or sigils. I frowned, running a finger over one of the markings. It felt strangely cold, almost slick, despite the dry air. I called Kevin over. "Hey, Kev, check this out. These stones, they're marked." Kevin came over, squinting at the fire pit. He ran a hand over the stones, his brow furrowing. "Huh, yeah, weird. Looks like a carvings. Or something." He shrugged. "Probably just some bored campers messing around." He tried to sound dismissive, but I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. We finished setting up camp in silence, the strange markings on the fire pit stones adding to the growing sense of wrongness about this place. As dusk began to creep in, casting long, distorted shadows from the twisted trees, the air grew even colder, the silence even heavier. The gray sky deepened to a bruised purple, and the first stars began to tentatively appear, pale and distant in the oppressive gloom. We tried to start a fire, but the wood, though dry, refused to catch. It sputtered and smoked, giving off weak, pathetic flames that flickered and died almost instantly. Kevin tried again and again, adding more kindling, more tinder, but it was no use. The wood just wouldn't burn. "Damn it," he muttered, frustrated, throwing down the lighter. "What the hell is wrong with this wood?" I shrugged, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. It wasn't the wood. It was this place. It was like the forest itself was rejecting our presence, refusing to allow even the simple comfort of a fire. As darkness fell completely, enveloping the clearing in an inky blackness that seemed to swallow even the faint starlight, the silence became absolute. No wind rustling the branches, no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just nothing. An empty, echoing void. We retreated into the Wanderer, the RV feeling suddenly small and vulnerable in the oppressive darkness. Kevin turned on the generator, the sudden rumble filling the silence, a jarring, almost painful sound. We turned on the lights, bathing the retro interior in a warm, artificial glow, a small, fragile bubble of normalcy in the encroaching darkness. We had a silent, uneasy dinner, the canned food tasting like ash in my mouth. Ranger lay to the table, whimpering softly, his eyes fixed on the windows, as if he could see something out there in the darkness that we couldn't. After dinner, we sat in strained silence, the hum of the generator and the soft whine of Ranger the only sounds in the RV. Kevin fiddled with the radio, trying to find a station, any station, but there was only static, a hissing, empty noise that was almost as unnerving as the silence outside. Maybe we should just go," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "Pack up and leave. Find another campsite. Any campsite, just not here." Kevin hesitated, glancing around the cozy, brightly lit interior of the RV, then back at the dark windows. He swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, maybe you're right. This place of it's giving me the creeps, man." We started to make preparations to leave, a frantic, hurried energy filling the RV. Kevin went outside to disconnect the power hookups, while I started stowing away loose items inside. Ranger, sensing our unease, became even more agitated, pacing back and forth, whining and scratching at the door. Then it started. A sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but growing steadily louder. A whisper. A soft, sighing sound like wind rustling through leaves. But there was no wind. The air outside was still heavy, suffocating. The whisper grew louder, becoming clearer, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was voices. Soft, murmuring voices. Just on the edge of hearing, whispering in the darkness just beyond the walls of the RV. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices were indistinct, unintelligible, but there were many of them, A chorus of whispers swirling around the wanderer, surrounding us and closing us. Ranger started to bark a frantic, terrified yelp, leaping up and scratching frantically at the door, desperate to get out, or maybe desperate to get away. Kevin came back inside, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He'd heard it too. What is that? He whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing chorus of whispers. I shook my head, my throat suddenly dry, unable to speak. I didn't know what it was, but I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever was whispering out there in the darkness, it wasn't friendly. And it was getting closer. Much closer. The whispers intensified, swirling around the RV, pressing in on us, becoming louder, clearer. And then I started to understand them. Not the words "not yet," but the tone. The feeling behind them. They weren't just whispers. They were calling to us, calling us to come out, calling us to join them in the darkness. And as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, I felt a cold, terrifying pull, a strange, irresistible urge to open the door, to step out into the darkness, to answer their call. And I knew with a bone-chilling certainty that if we did, we wouldn't be coming back. Our RV camping trip in Nebraska had become a deadly mistake, and I had a terrible feeling it was about to get much, much worse. The whispers intensified, no longer just murmuring sounds, but coalescing into something almost words. Not clear words, not yet, but the shape of words, the rhythm and cadence of speech, just beyond the edge of comprehension. They swirled around the RV, a disembodied chorus pressing in, and the tone was shifting, becoming less like a gentle breeze and more like a coaxing, seductive invitation. Dale, Kevin. The whispers seemed to murmur our names, soft and sibilant like breath on cold glass. Come out, Joy News. Ranger was going ballistic, barking and snarling at the windows, throwing himself against the door, a frenzy of fur and teeth and terrified sound. Kevin and I huddled together in the small living area of the RV, our faces pale in the artificial light, our breath catching in our throats. They know our names, Kevin whispered, his voice trembling. How do they know our names? I shook my head, my mind racing, trying to grasp the impossible. This wasn't just a creepy forest. This was something else, something sentient, malevolent, and it was targeting us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and now fragments of words began to break through the sibilant murmur. Lost, alone, afraid. They seemed to be echoing our own fears, our own vulnerabilities, twisting them into a seductive lure. No more fear, no more pain, just Joy News. And then the voices changed. They shifted again, becoming familiar. Deal. A voice soft and gentle. A voice I hadn't heard in years. A voice that could still bring tears to my eyes. Is that you, Dale? Come on out, honey. Mommy's here. My blood ran cold. That was my mother's voice. My mother, who had passed away 10 years ago. It was her voice, her tone, her gentle, loving cadence, perfectly horrifyingly replicated. I stumbled back, away from the window, my hand clamped over my mouth, a sob rising in my chest. It couldn't be, but it was. Or something was using her voice, twisting my most cherished memory into a weapon, a hook to drag me out into the darkness. Kevin. Now another voice rougher, more familiar to Kevin. Kev, buddy. It's me, Mark. Remember all those times, man. Come on out. Let's hang out like old times. Mark. Kevin's childhood friend who had died in a car accident when they were teenagers. His voice, too perfectly, cruelly imitated. The voices swirled around the RV, a chorus of the dead, the lost, the loved ones we had mourned, all calling us, beckoning us, promising comfort, promising reunion, promising an end to our fear and loneliness. But beneath the familiar tones, there was something else, something cold and alien, a subtle distortion that hinted at the monstrous entity beneath the surface. Don't listen to them, I choked out, my voice hoarse. It's not them. It's something else. They're trying to trick us. Kevin was staring at the window, tears are streaming down his face. Mark, he whispered, his voice breaking. Mark, is that really you? Kevin, no. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the window. Don't listen. It's a trap. But the voices were getting stronger, more persuasive, weaving a tapestry of grief and longing, preying on our deepest vulnerabilities. Come on, Dale, don't you want to see Mommy again? She misses you so much. My mother's voice, laced with a heartbreaking sadness that tore at my soul. Just come outside, Dale, just for a little while. Kevy. We have to go. Now, I yelled, shaking him, trying to break through the hypnotic pull of the voices. Start the RV, we have to get out of here. Kevin blinked, shaking his head as if waking from a dream. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion, but the fog of grief seemed to be lifting. Right, he stammered. Right, get out. Let's go. He scrambled towards the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. I ran to the door, unlocking it, ready to jump in and slam it shut the moment Kevin started the engine. But as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. The voices, they were right outside the door now, just inches away, whispering directly to me, my mother's voice so close, so real. It felt like she was standing right there on the other side of the thin metal door. Dale, please don't be afraid. We just want to help you. Just open the door. Dalla. The urge to open the door, to answer that call, was almost overwhelming. It was like a physical force pulling me forward, promising solace, promising reunion, promising an end to the nightmare. My hand trembled above the handle, my fingers itching to grasp it, to obey that seductive command. But then Ranger barked again, a sharp, furious bark right at my feet, snapping me out of the trance. His teeth were bared, his fur bristling, his eyes fixed on the door with pure, unadulterated hatred. His fierce, protective growl cut through the seductive whispers, reminding me of the real world, of the danger, of the monstrous deception behind those familiar voices. I recoiled from the door, stumbling back, my heart hammering in my chest. No, I shouted, my voice cracking. It's not real. It's not them. Kevin finally managed to start the engine, the RV roaring to life, the sudden noise shattering the hypnotic silence, momentarily drowning out the whispers. He slammed the RV into gear, the wheels spinning on the gravel, the wanderer lurching forward, away from the trees, away from the voices, away from the darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't dare. Kevin drove like a maniac, bouncing and swerving down the rough track, the RV rattling and groaning, branches whipping against the sides, the headlights cutting a shaky path through the oppressive gloom. Ranger was still barking, a continuous, frantic barrage of sound, as if trying to ward off whatever was pursuing us. The whispers faded as we drove, becoming fainter, more distant, until finally they were gone, swallowed by the roar of the engine and the wind rushing past the windows. But the silence that replaced them was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the memory of those voices, with the chilling realization of what we had almost succumbed to. We drove through the night, Kevin refusing to stop, refusing to slow down, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I sat beside him, numb with exhaustion and terror, Ranger huddled at my feet, still trembling occasionally. As dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky with a pale, watery light, the landscape began to change again. The twisted trees thinned, replaced by scrub brush, then gradually, blessedly, by fields of corn again. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, the silence less menacing. The sky, though still overcast, was a slightly less disturbing shade of gray. We drove until we reached a paved road, then another, and finally, blessedly, the interstate. We pulled into the first gas station we saw, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light, feeling like we were emerging from another world. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there in the RV, the rumble of the engine a comforting, familiar sound and the sudden normalcy of the gas station parking lot. People were moving around, filling their cars, buying coffee, talking on their phones, oblivious to the nightmare we had just escaped. Eventually, Kevin turned off the engine, the silence returning, but it was different now. Not oppressive, not menacing, just quiet. He looked at me, his eyes hollow, his face drawn and pale. Dale, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell was that place? I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that we had stumbled into something ancient, something evil, something that had almost consumed us, and we had barely escaped with our lives. We drove back in silence, the rest of the trip a blur of highways and gas stations and cheap modals. We never spoke about what happened in those woods. Not really. We couldn't. The memory was too raw, too terrifying, too unbelievable. Back home, I tried to return to my old life, to the predictable routine of spreadsheets and steak nights and college football. But everything felt different now. The silence of my apartment felt heavy, oppressive, and sometimes Late at night, I would hear whispers in the wind outside my window, soft, sibilant voices calling my name. I know it's just my imagination. I know it's just the wind. But sometimes, when the night is dark and the silence is deep, I can almost hear my mother's voice, soft and sad, whispering from the darkness, calling me back to the trees. And I know with a chilling certainty that part of me, a small, terrified part of me, will always be listening for that call. And I know deep down that I will never, ever go RV camping in Nebraska again, or anywhere that feels even remotely like those woods. Some wildernesses are best left unexplored. Some calls are best left unanswered. And some mistakes can be deadly. Story 7, my name is Jake. Just Jake. No fancy last name needed, especially not for this story. If you knew my last name, you might actually know my family, and trust me, you don't want to be associated with what happened out there in Nebraska. I'm a pretty average guy, I guess. 30-something, work a desk job pushing papers around, the kind of life that slowly drains the color from your soul. That's why I bought the RV. It was a beat-up old thing, a Class C from the late 90s. Smelled faintly of mildew and regret, but it was mine. I named her Wanderlust, which was maybe a bit ironic considering my usual routine involved a commute between my apartment and the office, and maybe the occasional grocery store run. But Wanderlust was supposed to be my ticket out, my escape hatch from the beige monotony. Nebraska wasn't exactly my dream destination, not like some postcard-perfect mountain range or a sun-drenched beach, but it was empty. Vast. Quiet, and that's what I craved. I'd mapped out a route through the western part of the state, aiming for some of those state parks I'd seen pictures of online, wide-open skies, rolling hills, and supposedly some of the darkest night skies in the country. Perfect for someone who just wanted to disappear for a while. I packed Wanderlust with the essentials camping gear, enough canned food to survive a minor apocalypse, fishing rods, optimistic, I know, and a stack of old paperbacks I'd been meaning to read. I even threw in my grandpa's old 20 rifle, mostly for show. I told myself. Nebraska probably wasn't that wild, right? The drive started out okay. Long stretches of highway, cornfields blurring past the windows, the hum of the RV engine a steady drone. I cranked up some classic rock, windows down, feeling that small thrill of freedom you get when you finally break free from the daily grind. By late afternoon, I'd reached the turn off for the state park I'd picked, a Halsey National Forest. National Forest, not state park, I corrected myself, glancing at the faded map. Even better, right? More remote. The paved road quickly turned to gravel, then to something barely more than a dirt track. Trees closed in on either side, the cornfields giving way to scrubby pines and gnarled oaks. The air got cooler, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns. It was peaceful, in a way. Exactly what I was looking for. I found a decent spot to park Wanderlust, a little ways off the track, nestled between a cluster of pines. Unpacked, set up my camp chairs, cracked open a lukewarm soda. The silence was almost deafening. No sirens, no distant city rumble. Just the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. For a while, anyway. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a different kind of quiet settled in. A thick, heavy quiet. The birds stopped chirping. The leaves stopped rustling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. And that's when I first heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Distant, muffled, but persistent, like a heartbeat, or maybe something bigger. I told myself it was just my imagination, the sounds of the forest settling down for the night. But as the darkness deepened, and the thumping grew a little louder, a little closer, a prickle of unease started to crawl up my spine. Wanderlust suddenly felt a lot less like an escape hatch, and a lot more like a flimsy metal box. Parked in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by something I couldn't quite name, but definitely didn't understand. And the sun hadn't even fully set yet. I tried to distract myself, flipped on the RV's little propane stove, heated up a can of chili. The metallic clunk of the spoon against the can echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. Every few bites, I'd pause, listening. The thumping was still there, a steady thump, thump, thump. It felt like it was getting closer, or maybe I was just getting more attuned to it. Just animals. I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident even though the words felt hollow. Deer, cattle. Nebraska was farm country, right? But this didn't sound like any farm animal I'd ever heard. This was deeper, more resonant, almost organic. Finished the chili, mostly tasteless, washed the spoon in a basin of water, the clinking sounds again too loud. Darkness had fully swallowed the clearing now. The inside of the RV was dim, lit only by a battery-powered lantern I'd hung from a hook. Outside it was black, absolute black. The kind of black that feels like it's pressing in on you. No stars, no moon, just black. I grabbed one of the paperbacks, a cheesy thriller I'd picked up at a used bookstore. Tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. My eyes kept flicking up, towards the windows, towards the woods. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every rustle of unseen leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. And the thumping's still there. Thump, thump, thump. Finally I gave up on the book. Too restless. Too on edge. I decided to take a walk, just a short one, around the clearing. Get some fresh air, clear my head. Stupid idea. Probably, but staying cooped up in Wanderlust was starting to feel like being trapped in a coffin. I grabbed my grandpa's, 22, more for comfort than actual protection, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, biting. Colder than it should have been for late summer, and the silence of it was suffocating. The thumping seemed to fade a little as I moved away from the RV, or maybe it was just masked by the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, flashlight beam cutting a weak swath through the darkness. Nothing. Just trees' shadows and that oppressive silence. Started to feel a little foolish, walking around in the dark with a rifle like some kind of paranoid city slicker. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just letting the quiet get to me. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, where the trees were thickest, something pale moved. A flicker of white in the blackness. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. Raised the rifle, safety off, finger trembling on the trigger. Hello. I called out, voice cracking, sounding way too high-pitched and scared. Silence. Then the rustling of leaves, a snapping twig. Whatever it was moving. Moving closer. Slowly. Deliberately. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. Nothing. Just shadows. But I could feel it. Something out there. Watching me. Waiting. Who's there? I yelled again, louder this time, trying to force some bravado in my voice. Show yourself. More silence. Then, a sound that wasn't rustling leaves or snapping twigs. A sound that made my blood run cold. A low giminin. High-pitched. And utterly, chillingly wrong. The giggle faded, swallowed by the silence. But it hung in the air, a phantom echo of something deeply unnatural. And then, the thumping started again, louder now, closer. Thump, thump, thump. Seemed to be coming from the same direction as the giggle. I didn't wait to see what was making those sounds. Didn't wait to find out what was giggling in the dark. I turned and ran, tripped over a root, stumbled, scrambled back to my feet, rifle clutched tight in my hands. Ran blindly, desperately, back towards the faint, flickering glow of the lantern in Wanderlust's window. Slammed the RV door shut behind me, fumbled with the flimsy lock, heart pounding like a drum solo. Leaned against the door, gasping for breath, listening. The thumping was still there outside, circling the RV now. Thump, thump, and I could swear, and I could hear that giggle again, too. Faint, distant, but definitely there. I was trapped. Trapped in my metal box, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by something giggling and thumping in the Nebraska darkness. And the night was still young, very young. Inside Wanderlust, the lantern light seemed pathetic, barely pushing back the oppressive darkness. Every creak of the RV, every sigh of the wind, when it dared to blow, sounded magnified, distorted, like the prelude to something breaking in. I kept the rifle pointed at the door, finger tight on the trigger. But what was I going to shoot? Shadows. Giggles. Heartbeats in the woods. The thumping continued its relentless circle around the RV. Thump, 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 thump. Sometimes it would pause right outside a window, and I'd flinch, expecting to see something peering in, some pale face pressed against the glass. But there was never anything there. Just blackness, and the thumping would resume its slow, agonizing rhythm. Hours crawled by. Time seemed to stretch and warp, just like the shadows outside. I tried to stay awake, adrenaline keeping me wired, but exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. My big eyelids felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. I knew I should try to sleep, knew I couldn't keep this up all night, but the thought of closing my eyes, of surrendering to the darkness, was terrifying. At some point, the thumping changed. It became faster, more erratic. Thump, 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 like whatever was out there was getting agitated, impatient. And the giggling, it was closer now, definitely closer. Whispering right outside the thin metal walls of the RV. I couldn't make out words, just that high, chilling sound, laced with a kind of gleeful malice that made my stomach churn. Then the scratching started. Faint at first, almost like a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but it grew quickly, becoming more insistent, more deliberate. Scritch, scritch, scritch like fingernails on metal long, sharp fingernails. Dragging slowly, methodically, across the side of Wanderlust. I squeezed my eyes shut, rifle trembling in my hands. Tried to block out the sounds, tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just the wind, just my imagination running wild. But the scratching was real. I could feel the vibrations through the thin metal skin of the RV. It was circling now, just like the thumping had, but closer, much closer, right against the walls. Scritch, scritch, giggle, thump, scritch, giggle, thump. The sounds were overlapping now, a horrifying symphony of dread. I pressed myself back against the wall, as far away from the scratching as I could get, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the cold seeping into the RV, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the cold of fear, the cold of something ancient and wrong pressing in. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Silence descended again, thicker, heavier than before. The thumping was gone too. Just silence. A silence so profound it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. I held my breath, straining my ears, every nerve in my body screaming. Was it gone? Had it finally left? Hope, fragile and foolish, flickered in my chest. Then the window shattered. Not a crash, not a bang, just a sharp, sudden crack, like ice breaking. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the small window beside the dinette. And through the broken glass, something reached. A hand, pale, skeletal, impossibly long fingers tipped with black, sharp nails. It snaked through the broken window, reaching, groping, like a thing from a nightmare made flesh. The skin was stretched tight over bone, almost translucent, veins pulsing faintly blue beneath the surface. I recoiled, screaming, scrambling back, knocking over the lantern. Darkness plunged into the RV, absolute, terrifying darkness. The hand kept reaching, blindly searching, those long, skeletal fingers flexing, twitching. I fired the rifle, point blank, into the broken window, into the pale hand. The roar of the .22 in the confined space was deafening, blinding. Sparks flew, glass shards sprayed inwards. And the hand jerked back. For a moment, blessed silence. Then, a sound that was worse than the thumping, worse than the giggling, worse than the scratching. A sound that I will never, ever forget. A scream. But not human. Not animal. Something in between. Something twisted and broken and filled with unimaginable pain and rage. A high, keening wail that seemed to vibrate in my bones, that tore through the silence and echoed through the woods, a sound that promised only death and madness. The RV started to shake, violently, rocking back and forth, side to side, like a toy in the hands of a giant. I was thrown against the wall, rifle flying from my grasp, hitting the floor with a clatter. The shaking intensified, the RV groaning, metal screeching, the whole thing threatening to tip over. I was on the floor, scrambling, crawling, trying to find the door, trying to escape. But the RV was a cage now, a metal coffin being shaken by unseen hands. The screaming continued, deafening, unbearable. And through the chaos, through the shaking and the screaming, I saw it. In the darkness, just for a fleeting moment, a flicker of white. A tall, gaunt figure pressed against the side of the RV, barely visible in the blackness. A woman, maybe. Or something that had once been a woman. Pale dress, long tangled hair, and a face that was just shadows and holes where eyes and mouth should have been. And in those holes, a darkness that seemed to swallow the light, a darkness that promised nothing but oblivion. Then everything went black. I woke up in the dirt outside the RV. Sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the trees. The RV was on its side, wheels spinning uselessly in the air, windows shattered, metal twisted and torn. Silent. Completely, utterly silent. No thumping, no giggling, no scratching, no screaming. Just the morning birds chirping like nothing had ever happened. I crawled away from the wreckage, stumbling to my feet, legs shaky, head pounding. Walk blindly, mind blank. Just putting one foot in front of the other until I reached the dirt track and then the gravel road and finally, blessedly, the paved highway. I don't remember how I got back to civilization. Don't remember who found me or how long I was walking. Just fragments, flashes of memory sunlight, asphalt, the rumble of a passing truck, a kind face asking if I was okay. They said I was dehydrated, delirious. Said I'd probably just gotten lost, maybe had a bad fall, imagine the rest. They patched me up, gave me food and water, and sent me on my way. No one believed my story. No one ever does. But I know what I heard, I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I still hear it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The thumping and the giggle. Whispering from the Nebraska darkness. Waiting for me to come back. Waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too far into the quiet. And I know, deep down, that one day I will hear it again, not in my memory, but in the stillness of the night. And when that happens, I fear I won't be able to resist the call, because the Nebraska darkness, it doesn't let go. Not ever. Story 8, my name is Jake, and I've always been drawn to the open road. There's something about the endless stretch of asphalt, the changing landscapes blurring past your windows, that just gets under my skin in the best way. Use time, though. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment that familiar thrill curdled into something cold and sharp in my gut. It started innocently enough. My buddy Mark, he's always been the planner in our duo. He came up with this grand idea for an RV camping trip. Nebraska, of all places. Think about it, Jake, he'd said, eyes gleaming with that over-enthusiastic spark he gets when he's convinced he's onto something genius. Wide open skies, the Great Plains, we can get lost in the real heartland of America. Honestly, Nebraska wasn't exactly topping my list of dream destinations. Mountains, forests, even a decent beach, those were more my speed. But Mark was persuasive, and he'd already gone and rented this beast of an RV, a Class A, he called it. Something that looked like a land yacht on wheels. Plus, after the year I'd had job loss, messy breakup, the whole shebang, the idea of just escaping, of leaving everything behind for a while, was undeniably appealing. So I agreed. We roped in Sarah, Mark's girlfriend, who was always up for an adventure, and my younger sister, Emily, who was still in college and easily swayed by the promise of freedom and Instagram-worthy sunsets. 4 of us, crammed into a rolling house, heading to the Cornhusker State. The drive started out fun, I'll give it that. We stocked up on snacks, blasted classic rock, and joked around as we chewed up the miles. The RV was surprisingly comfortable, all plush seats and shiny chrome. Mark was in his element behind the wheel. Sarah navigated with her phone. Emily was glued to the window, taking pictures of every quirky roadside attraction. And I mostly just watched the landscape change. That's when the first little prickle of unease started. As we crossed the state line into Nebraska, the scenery shifted. It wasn't just the cornfields stretching out to the horizon, mile after mile, though that was definitely part of it. It was flatter, emptier. The sky felt bigger, pressing down, and the air itself seemed to thicken, to become heavy. The towns we passed through were small, almost ghost-like. Main streets with boarded-up storefronts, houses with paint peeling like sunburnt skin. People with faces that seemed etched with a kind of quiet wariness. It was like the color had been drained out of everything, leaving behind shades of beige and gray under that vast, unforgiving sky. We were headed to a state park Mark had picked out, somewhere in the western part of the state, promising hiking trails and scenic overlooks. He booked a spot online, said it was supposed to be beautiful, a hidden gem. But as we drove further west, following the GPS deeper into the heart of Nebraska, the roads narrowed, the trees thinned out, and that feeling in my gut just kept growing. By the time we finally reached the state park entrance, the sun was starting to dip low, painting the endless fields in streaks of blood orange and bruised purple. The park ranger at the gate was a woman with tired eyes and a voice that sounded like gravel. She barely glanced at us, just handed Mark a map and a list of rules, her movements stiff and mechanical. Campsite 12, she mumbled, pointing a thick finger at a circle spot on the map. Back of the park. Don't wander off the trails after dark. And be careful out there. Be careful. It was the way she said it, flat and devoid of any real inflection that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Careful of what? Bears, mountain lions, or something else entirely. Mark just chuckled, ever the optimist. Thanks, he called out, rolling up the window. As we drove past the gate and into the park, I glanced back at the ranger in my side mirror. She was still watching us, her face unreadable, a silhouette against the dying light. And in that moment, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this RV camping trip in Nebraska was going to be anything but ordinary. It was going to be a mistake. A deadly mistake. Campsite 12 was even further into the park than I expected. The road twisted and turned, the RV lumbering through deepening shadows cast by gnarled trees that seemed to claw at the sky. These cynic overlooks. Mark had raved about they were overlooks, all right? Overlooks into vast, empty stretches of land that seemed to swallow the fading light. Beautiful, maybe in a desolate, unsettling kind of way. We finally pulled into the campsite, just as the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon. It was a small clearing, ringed by more of those skeletal trees, with a fire pit in the center and a picnic table that looked like it had seen better decades. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dry earth, and something faintly metallic, like rust. Home sweet home, Mark announced, trying to sound cheerful, but even his voice seemed a little strained in the unnatural quiet. He parked the RV, and the engine cuffed and died, leaving us in a silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Sarah was the first to break it. Okay, who's hungry? I packed hot dogs. She busied herself in the RV kitchen, rattling pans and trying to inject some normalcy into the atmosphere. Emily, ever the picture taker, hopped out with her phone, snapping photos of the twilight and the RV silhouetted against the darkening trees. I just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The silence, the emptiness, the way the shadows seemed to deepen and wreathe around the edges of the clearing. It wasn't just the usual woods at night kind of quiet. This was different, heavy, like something was listening, watching. Dusk bled into full night quickly. Sarah managed to cook up a surprisingly decent meal of hot dogs and beans, and we ate around the picnic table, huddled in the flickering lantern light. Emily tried to lighten the mood with stories about her classes and campus gossip, but even she seemed subdued, her usual bubbly energy dampened by the oppressive stillness of the place. Mark, bless his heart, kept up the facade of enthusiasm, pointing out constellations in the impossibly vast sky and trying to identify the distant sounds of crickets and something else. Something that wasn't crickets. A low, rhythmic thumping, far off in the distance. Hear that? I asked, finally breaking my own silence. Everyone stopped talking, forks halfway to their mouths. We listened. The crickets chirped. The wind rustled faintly in the trees, and then there it was again. Thump, 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 a slow, deliberate beat, like a giant, sluggish heartbeat echoing from the earth itself. What is that? Emily whispered, her eyes wide. Mark frowned, tilting his head. Probably just some kind of animal, maybe a deer stumping around. He sounded unconvinced even to himself. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. It's kind of creepy. The thumping continued, a constant unsettling pulse in the background. We finished dinner in a strained silence, the cheerful campfire conversation we'd imagined failing to materialize. The hot dogs tasted like ash in my mouth, the beans like sawdust. After dinner, Mark, ever the outdoorsman, insisted on building a proper campfire. He gathered wood, fussed with kindling, and finally coaxed a small flame into life. The fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. But even the firelight felt weak, swallowed up by the encroaching darkness. We sat around the fire for a while, trying to talk, but conversation kept dying out, strangled by the oppressive quiet and that persistent, rhythmic thumping. Emily was the first to retreat to the RV, claiming she was tired. Sarah followed soon after, muttering something about wanting to read. That left just Mark and me by the fire, the flames casting flickering patterns on our faces. You still hear that thumping? I asked Mark, breaking the silence. He nodded slowly, staring into the fire. Yeah, it's weird, right? He poked at the embers with a stick, sending sparks flying into the darkness. Maybe it's just the wind playing tricks. Or, I don't know, underground springs or something. I didn't think it was wind or springs. It felt deeper than that, more organic, like something alive breathing beneath the earth. "You think the ranger, she seemed kind of spooked, back at the gate," I said, remembering her warning. "You think she knew something?" Mark shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "Rangers always say stuff like that. Just park spiel, you know. Be careful of the wildlife. Don't feed the beers. Don't wander off the trails after dark standard stuff." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow in the stillness, but I didn't believe him. And I knew deep down that he didn't believe it either. There was something wrong here. Something deeply, fundamentally wrong. The fire started to die down. The flames shrinking, the embers glowing a dull red. The thumping continued, a relentless subterranean pulse. The shadows around us seemed to deepen, to press in, and the silence grew heavier, more watchful. "Maybe we should head in," I suggested, finally. "It's getting late." Mark nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Yeah, good idea. Early start tomorrow, right? Hiking and all that." He didn't sound enthusiastic about hiking anymore. We doused the fire, the hiss of steam swallowed almost instantly by the silence. We retreated to the RV, locking the door behind us, the heavy bolt clicking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the RV felt like a flimsy shell against the vast, unknowable darkness outside. I crawled into my bunk, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. The thumping was fainter inside the RV, but still audible, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones. Emily and Sarah were already in their bunks. The only sound their soft, even breathing. Mark was in the front, presumably getting ready for bed. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the thumping, the silence, the feeling of being watched. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced, replaying the ranger's warning, the desolate towns we'd passed through, the oppressive emptiness of the landscape. And that thumping, what was it? What was out there in the Nebraska darkness, listening, waiting? Suddenly, I heard it again. Not the thumping, something else. Faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper, just at the edge of hearing, drifting in from the darkness outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, closer this time. Just a breath of sound, barely audible above the rustling leaves and the distant thump, thump, thump. But this time, I could almost make out words. Faint, distorted, carried on the night wind. Whispers in the dark, and they sounded like my name. My blood ran cold. Whispers. My name, it had to be my imagination, the wind playing tricks, the stress getting to me. But the feeling of unease was overwhelming, a primal dread that clenched my stomach and made my heart hammer against my ribs. I sat bolt upright in my bunk, straining my ears, listening intently. Silence. Just the crickets, the wind, the distant rhythmic thump, thump, thump again, and then the whisper this time, almost lost in the rustling leaves, but still there. Jakey, it was definitely my name, or something that sounded like it. Distorted, breathy, like it was being spoken through layers of earth and shadow, and it was coming from outside the RV, from the darkness beyond the thin metal walls. I wanted to wake Mark to tell him what I was hearing, but a strange paralysis held me in place. Fear, yes, but something else too. A morbid curiosity, a terrifying compulsion to listen, to understand. The whispers continued, weaving in and out of the night sounds, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always just at the edge of perception. They weren't saying anything coherent, just murmuring syllables, distorted vowels, my name whispered on the wind. Sleep was impossible. I lay there, rigid, with tension, listening to the whispers, the thumping, the silence, the darkness pressing in. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each minute feeling like an hour, each thump of that subterranean heartbeat echoing in my soul. Dawn finally broke, a pale, anemic light seeping through the RV windows. I stumbled out of my bunk, exhausted, my nerves frayed, my mind reeling. Emily and Sarah were already awake, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Emily nodded slowly, her lower lip trembling, whispering, like someone calling my name. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear. I heard it too, and that thumping, it never stopped. We looked at each other, the unspoken fear hanging heavy in the air. Mark emerged from the front of the RV, stretching, trying to force a smile. Morning campers, ready for some breakfast. But even his forced cheerfulness couldn't mask the unease in his eyes. We ate breakfast in silence again, the whispers and the thumping still echoing in our minds. even if they weren't audible in the daylight. The food tasted like cardboard, the coffee like bitter ash. The sun climbed higher, but the oppressive atmosphere of the campsite didn't lift. The shadows still seemed too deep, the silence too watchful. We should hike," Mark said, finally breaking the silence. "Jet out of here for a while. See some of the park." It was a transparent attempt to escape the growing tension, to find some normalcy in the unnatural stillness. We packed up some water and snacks, and set off down one of the marked trails, leaving the RV and the unsettling campsite behind. The trail wound through the skeletal trees, deeper into the heart of the park. The landscape was stark, almost lunar, with patches of dry grass and scrub brush clinging to the pale, cracked earth. As we walked, the whispers seemed to fade, or maybe we were just getting used to them, filtering them out as background noise. But the thumping was still there, a constant, rhythmic pulse beneath our feet, vibrating up through the ground and into our bones. After a couple of hours of hiking, the trail led us to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, half hidden by a screen of brush, was a structure. Not a ranger station, not a picnic shelter. A house, or what was left of one. It was partially buried in a low rise of earth, the roofline sagging, the windows dark and empty. The wood was weathered and gray, the paint peeling in long, ragged strips. It looked ancient, forgotten, swallowed by the land. "What is that?" Emily whispered, stopping dead in her tracks. Mark frowned, consulting the park map. "Doesn't show anything like this on the map. Must be an old homestead, abandoned a long time ago." But his voice was hesitant, uncertain. We approached the house cautiously, drawn by a morbid curiosity, a sense of foreboding that was almost magnetic. The air around the house felt colder, heavier, the silence more profound. The thumping seemed to grow louder as we got closer, resonating from the earth beneath our feet, drawing us in. The front door of the house was hanging open, creaking faintly in the wind. Darkness yawned within, swallowing the meager daylight. A musty, earthy smell drifted out, mixed with that faint metallic tang I'd noticed at the campsite. Rust and something else, something organic. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. Silence answered him, just the wind sighing through the trees. The distant thump, 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 and the faintest of whispers carried on the breeze. He hesitated, then stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah followed, then Emily. I was last, lingering at the threshold, a cold dread gripping my heart. I didn't want to go in there. Every instinct screamed to me to turn back, to run, to escape this place, and never look back. But the whispers, they were stronger here, closer, clearer. "Jakey, come home, Jakey, you've always been here." And something else, too. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, drifting from the darkness within the house. A scent that was both sickeningly sweet and horribly familiar. The scent of decay. And something else, something deeper, something ancient and hungry. The scent of the earth itself, breathing, waiting. With a sigh that felt like the last breath of my old life, I stepped inside. The door creaked shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. And the whispers, they were no longer whispers. They were all around me now, inside my head, inside my soul. A chorus of voices welcoming me home. "Welcome home. Jake, welcome home. You've always been here." The darkness closed over me, heavy and suffocating. And the thumping thump, thump, it wasn't coming from the earth anymore. It was coming from inside the house. From inside me, my own heart, beating in time with something ancient, something hungry, something that had been waiting for me here, in the darkness, all along. My RV camping trip in Nebraska wasn't just a mistake. It was a homecoming. And there was no escape, only the whispers in the dark, the thumping of the earth, and the endless night closing in. Story 9. My name is Jake, and I've always been a sucker for the open road. There's something about the endless stretches of highway, the changing landscapes blurring past your windows, that just gets under my skin in the best way. Last summer, I finally decided to scratch that itch properly. I convinced my buddy, Chris, a guy who's usually more comfortable in front of a computer screen than, say, a campfire, to join me on an RV camping trip. Nebraska was the destination. Yeah, I know. Nebraska might not scream adventure to everyone, but I'd heard whispers about its stark beauty, its wide, open skies, and these quirky little campgrounds tucked away in places you'd never expect. Plus, Chris's grandpa had this old RV sitting in his backyard, practically begging to be used. Free RV, wide open spaces. Seemed like a no-brainer. We spent a weekend cleaning out the RV, which we affectionately nicknamed the Wanderer. It was vintage for sure, all wood paneling and avocado green appliances, but it had character, and more importantly, it ran. After stocking up on supplies and a jerky, chips, and soda to last us a month, or so Chris claimed, we hit the road early on a Tuesday morning. The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. Sun shining, windows down, classic rock blasting from the RV's ancient radio. Nebraska rolled by in a tapestry of cornfields, golden wheat fields, and the occasional charming small town. We stopped at a roadside diner for greasy burgers and milkshakes, and Chris even managed to put down his phone for a solid hour to actually appreciate the scenery. Progress. We'd booked a spot at a campground called Prairie Whispers. The website promised secluded campsites nestled amongst rolling hills, and unparalleled stargazing sounded perfect. As we drove further west, the landscape started to change. The cornfields thinned out, replaced by vast, undulating grasslands. The sky seemed to get bigger, stretching out in every direction until it met the horizon in a hazy blue line. It was different, beautiful in a way, but also empty. Unsettlingly so. The GAN directions to Prairie Whispers took us off the main highway and onto increasingly smaller roads, eventually turning into a gravel track that seemed to lead to the middle of nowhere. We bounced along, dust billowing behind the Wanderer, the silence broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional squawk from the CB radio, which, of course, was also vintage and mostly static. Finally, we saw a small, weathered wooden sign that read, Prairie Whispers next left. We turned onto an even narrower dirt road, barely more than a track, that wound its way through tall grasses that brushed against the sides of the RV like ghostly fingers. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and stretched across the landscape. As we pulled into the campground, my initial excitement started to fade, replaced by a prickle of unease. Secluded was an understatement. There was no ranger station, no other RVs, no sign of life whatsoever. Just a small clearing surrounded by low, whispering hills and silence. A silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing down on you. Chris, ever the optimist, tried to sound enthusiastic. Well, look at this, Jake. We've got the whole place to ourselves. Talk about peace and quiet. He hopped out of the RV, stretching and grinning, but even his smile seemed a little forced. I stepped out after him, Shadow, my German shepherd, bounding out ahead of me, sniffing the air. Usually Shadow was all tail wags and happy barks, but now he was quiet, his ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He circled the perimeter of our campsite, his hackles raised, sniffing at the tall grass like he'd caught a whiff of something unpleasant. Easy boy, I murmured, trying to reassure him and myself. Probably just rabbits or something. But deep down I knew it wasn't rabbits. There was something else here. Something in the air, in the silence, in the way the shadows seemed to deepen and twist in the fading light. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Prairie Whispers. It was certainly whispering something, all right, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what it had to say. We set about getting camp set up, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Chris, still trying to keep things light, wrestled with the RV's awning, muttering about vintage charm as it stubbornly refused to extend. I busied myself starting a fire pit, gathering dry branches and kindling, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind off the oppressive silence. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the campground into a premature twilight. The unparalleled stargazing promised on the website was definitely going to deliver. The sky was a vast, inky black canvas already sprinkled with a million distant stars. Beautiful, yes, but also isolating. Out here, under this immense, indifferent sky, we felt utterly alone. As darkness deepened, the silence intensified. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, a thick, muffling blanket that seemed to absorb every noise, every whisper. The crackle of the fire, which I'd finally managed to coax to life, sounded strangely muted. Swallowed by the surrounding void, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Shadow remained on high alert, pacing restlessly around the campsite, his low growl a constant. unsettling undercurrent to the silence. He'd stop every few minutes, nose twitching, staring intently into the darkness beyond the firelight, as if listening for something we couldn't hear, sensing something we couldn't perceive. He's really spooked, huh? Chris said, finally giving up on the awning and joining me by the fire. He was watching Shadow, a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. Think there are coyotes or something. Maybe, I said, though I doubted it. Coyotes were nosy. This was something else. Something quieter, more deliberate. We ate a quick dinner of lukewarm chili from a can, the metallic taste doing little to settle the unease in my stomachs. Conversation was stilted, punctuated by long stretches of silence. Chris, usually a chatterbox, seemed subdued, his usual jokes falling flat in the heavy atmosphere. He kept glancing nervously into the darkness, his eyes wide and darting. After dinner, we sat by the fire, ostensibly enjoying the stargazing, but really just staring into the blackness, jumpy and on edge. The stars were incredible, brighter and more numerous than I'd ever seen, but even their beauty felt cold, distant, detached from our little island of firelight. Then the sound started. Subtle at first, almost imagined. A rustle in the grass just beyond the firelight, a twig snapping in the distance, the soft pad of footsteps on dry leaves. Each sound in the oppressive silence was amplified, magnified, sending jolts of adrenaline through my system. Did you hear that? Chris whispered, his voice tight, barely audible above the crackling fire. Yeah, I said, my hand instinctively getting the knife I always carried on my belt. Probably just deer. But again, I didn't believe it. Deer weren't that quiet, and they didn't circle, because that's what it sounded like, circling. Something moving just beyond the edge of our vision, just out of reach of the firelight, moving around us, slowly, deliberately. Shadow's growl intensified, deepening into a low, guttural rumble that vibrated in my chest. He was facing the darkness, his body rigid, every muscle tense. He wasn't just spooked anymore, he was terrified. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the rustling and snapping. A high-pitched, keening sound like a child crying. It was faint, distant, carried on the non-existent breeze, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the hills behind our campsite, echoing eerily in the still night air. Chris jumped, nearly knocking over his camping chair. What the hell was that? He stammered, his face pale in the firelight. I don't know, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But a cold dread was creeping into my heart, a primal fear that whispered of something ancient, something malevolent, lurking in the darkness around us. Prairie Whispers wasn't just whispering anymore. It was starting to scream, and I had a sickening feeling that scream was meant for us. The crying grew louder, closer, no longer faint and distant. It was still high-pitched, but now it had a ragged edge, a desperate, breathy quality that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound like a child anymore. It sounded wrong, like something trying to mimic a child's cry, but failing miserably. Shadow whined, a low, pitiful sound that tore at my heart. He pressed himself against my leg, trembling uncontrollably. I knelt down, burying my hand in his fur, trying to offer him and myself some kind of comfort. Okay, I murmured, my voice cracking. It's gonna be okay. Just animals. Yeah, just animals, Dalise. I knew I was lying, and Chris knew it too. The rustling intensified, the circling sounds becoming more distinct, more purposeful. It was like we were surrounded, completely enclosed by something unseen, something that was moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching us, waiting. The keening cry came again, closer still, and this time it was joined by another sound. A low, guttural chuckle, wet and gurgling, that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. It was the most unnatural, horrifying sound I'd ever heard, and it clawed at my sanity, twisting my gut into knots of icy dread. Chris scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror, darting wildly around the campsite. Jake, what is that? What the fuck is that? His voice was a panicked whisper, barely audible. I don't know. I choked out, my throat suddenly dry and tight. But a terrifying idea was forming in my mind, a horrifying possibility that I desperately didn't want to believe. What if it wasn't animals? What if it was something else? Something that Prairie Whispers was whispering about. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks flying into the air, our only defense against the encroaching darkness. The green tinge to the flames seemed more pronounced now, sickly and unnatural, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed around us. Suddenly, the crying stopped, the chuckling faded, the rustling ceased. The silence returned heavier, more oppressive than ever. It was a silence that screamed, a silence that held its breath, waiting. We stood frozen, Chris and I, huddled together by the fire, shadow trembling between us, every nerve in our bodies screaming with raw, primal fear. We strained our ears, listening for any sound, any indication of what was out there, but there was only the silence, thick and suffocating. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. A shape indistinct and shadowy, but undeniably there, moving slowly, deliberately closer to the edge of our light. I grabbed Chris's arm, my grip like a vise. "Thier," I whispered, pointing into the darkness. "Did you see that?" Chris followed my gaze, his eyes widening further, if that was even possible. He gasped, choked, strangled sound. Yeah, I saw it." What is it?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. But as the shape moved closer, I started to make out details. Tall. Too tall. And thin, impossibly thin, like a stick figure stretched and elongated to grotesque proportions. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, limbs bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. And then I saw the eyes. 2 points of light in the darkness, burning with an unnatural, malevolent glow. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, knowing, and they were fixed on us. The shape stopped at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the flickering flames, and stood there, motionless, watching us. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, broken only by the frantic pounding of my heart in my ears. Chris started to whimper, a low, pathetic sound. He backed away from the fire, stumbling over his own feet, his eyes glued to the shape in the darkness. "We gotta go, Jake," he stammered, his voice trembling. "We gotta get out of here." He was right. Staying here was suicide. But where could we go? We were miles from civilization, surrounded by darkness and whatever that thing was. I grabbed Chris's hand, pulling him back towards the RV. "Come on," I hissed. "Get in the RV. We're leaving." We scrambled back to the Wanderer, fumbling with the door handle, desperate to get inside, to put some kind of barrier between us and the thing in the darkness. Shadow, sensing the urgency, darted ahead, leaping into the RV and barking frantically, urging us to hurry. We slammed the RV door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The sudden enclosure, the thin metal walls offered a flimsy sense of security, but I knew it was an illusion. Whatever was out there, I had a feeling a locked RV door wouldn't stop it for long. Chris collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, his face ashen. "Drive, Jake, drive. Just drive." I nodded, adrenaline surging through me, and scrambled into the driver's seat. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I almost missed. The engine cuffed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, the sudden noise shattering the oppressive silence. I slammed the RV into reverse, backing out of the campsite, tires spitting gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the shape was still there, watching us. I just wanted to get away, to escape prairie whispers and the horrors it held in its silent, whispering embrace. As we bounced and rattled down the dirt track, back towards the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The campground was receding behind us, swallowed by the darkness. But for a fleeting moment, in the dim glow of the RV's taillights, I thought I saw something at the edge of the clearing. A tall, thin shape standing motionless, watching us go. And those 2 points of light burning in the darkness, following us with their cold, knowing gaze. I didn't look back again. I just drove. Drove as fast as the Wanderer would go down the gravel track, onto the smaller roads, back towards the highway, and towards whatever lay beyond prairie whispers. Whether we truly escaped, or if we carried something of that place with us, I didn't know. And part of me, a terrified, shivering part, suspected that we never really would. Some whispers once heard can never be unheard. And some places just don't let you leave without taking a piece of you with them. Story 10, my name is Jake. And if you'd told me a month ago I'd be writing this, trying to make sense of what happened out in the Nebraska wilderness, I'd have laughed in your face. Me, spooked. Nah, I'm a practical guy, always have been. Give me a problem, I'll find a solution. That's how I survived my marriage anyway. Just kidding mostly. Truth is, I needed to get away. Work had been a grind, city life was suffocating, and the walls of my apartment were starting to feel like they were closing in. So, I did what any self-respecting, slightly past his prime American male does when the word gets too loud. I dusted off my RV, the Wanderer, and pointed it west. Nebraska. Why Nebraska? Honestly, it was a pin on a map. A state I'd only ever driven through on I-80, a blur of cornfields and billboards. But this time, I wanted to see the real Nebraska, the stuff you don't see from the interstate. I'd heard whispers of vast skies, rolling hills, and a quiet that could swallow you whole. That quiet sounded good to me. My plan was simple: find a secluded campground, park the Wanderer, and spend a week doing absolutely nothing. No deadlines, no emails, no Karen from accounting breathing down my neck. Just me, the open road, and maybe a few too many cans of lukewarm beer. I spent a day stocking up: canned goods, bottled water, enough beef jerky to choke a horse, and of course the aforementioned beer. I checked the RV's fluids, tires, and generator, making sure the Wanderer, despite her age, was ready for one last hurrah. She's an old girl in 98 Fleetwood, but she's got character, you know? Like a reliable old dog, a bit rough around the edges, but always gets you where you need to go. The drive started out easy enough. Highway miles melted away, the landscape slowly shifting from urban sprawl to the promised cornfields. By late afternoon, I'd veered off the main roads, following a winding state highway that seemed to get narrower and emptier with each passing mile. The GPS on my phone was starting to get spotty, flickering in and out of service like a dying firefly. No problem, I muttered to myself, tapping the dashboard. That's why we brought paper maps, right? Though if I was being honest, the paper map in the glove compartment looked older than the Wanderer herself. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, no doubt, but there was something unsettling about it. The silence was heavier out here, more profound than I'd anticipated. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, the kind that feels like it's listening back. I finally spotted a sign for a state recreation area, Silent Creek Campground. Perfect, I thought, maybe a little too perfect. I turned down a gravel road, the RV bouncing and rattling as it crunched over loose stones. The road narrowed again, trees crowding in on either side, their branches gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers. The air grew noticeably colder, a damp chill that seeped into the RV, even with the heater running. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the campground entrance. Entrance might be too generous a word. It was more like a gap in the trees, marked by a weathered wooden sign, half rotted and barely legible. Silent Creek Campground was painted on it in faded green letters, and below, in smaller print, something else was scrawled, almost scratched into the wood. I squinted, trying to make it out in the fading light. It looked like Leave Before Dark. I frowned. Leave Before Dark. What kind of campground sign was that? Some kind of weird joke, or a warning. A shiver traced its way down my spine despite myself. Nah, probably just some local folklore, I told myself, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Still, that sign gets stuck in my mind as I drove. The wander deeper into the woods, the last rays of sunlight fading behind the trees, leaving me in a silence that was anything but silent. Ignoring the unsettling sign, I nudged the Wanderer through the gap in the trees and into what was supposed to be the campground. Campground was another generous term. It was more like a clearing hacked out of the woods, barely big enough to turn the RV around. A few fire rings, choked with weeds and rusting cans, were scattered around haphazardly. There was a picnic table, splintered and covered in moss, leaning precariously to one side. No other RVs, no tents, no people. Just me, the Wanderer, and a whole lot of trees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The Silent Creek itself, I guessed, was a sluggish, dark ribbon of water that snaked along the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the undergrowth. It didn't look or sound particularly inviting, more like a stagnant ditch than a creek. No cheerful babbling here, just a low, almost imperceptible murmur that sounded less like water and more like sighing. Dusk was deepening into full night. Shadows stretched long and distorted from the trees, turning familiar shapes into menacing figures. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified in the oppressive silence. Cooper, my usually unflappable Labrador, was getting restless. He whined softly from the passenger seat, ears perked, eyes darting around the clearing. He wasn't growling, not yet, but his unease was palpable. Dogs know things, things we humans miss. I parked the Wanderer as level as I could manage on the uneven ground, killed the engine, and the silence descended again, heavier than before. It pressed in on me, a physical weight. I fumbled for the flashlight, its beam cutting a weak swath through the gloom. Stepping out of the RV, the cold hit me full force. It was colder than had any right to be for early fall in Nebraska, a bone-chilling dampness that seeped right through my jacket. "All right, buddy," I said to Cooper, trying to sound upbeat. "Let's get this show on the road." He just whined again, nudging my hand with his wet nose. I clipped on his leash anyway, and we started to circle the clearing, getting a feel for the place. It was desolate. More so than I imagined. The fire rings were ancient, some almost completely overgrown. The picnic table looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a sense of profound neglect, of abandonment that went beyond just lack of maintenance. It felt like this place had been deliberately forgotten, shunned. As we walked, I noticed something else. There were no sounds of wildlife, no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just nothing. An unnatural stillness that was far more disturbing than any noise would have been. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath here. We reached the edge of the creek. The water was black, reflecting the faint starlight like obsidian. I shone the flashlight beam into it, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see the bottom, couldn't even tell if the water was moving. It just sat there, still and silent like a pool of ink. Cooper suddenly stiffened, a low-growl rumbling in his chest. He was staring into the woods. Beyond the creek, his hackles raised. I followed his gaze, my heart starting to pound. The trees were a solid wall of blackness, impenetrable in the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but Cooper's reaction was enough to send a fresh wave of unease washing over me. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, tightening my grip on the flashlight and instinctively reaching for the small camping axe I'd brought. Cooper just kept growling, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through his whole body. He wasn't just spooked, he was genuinely afraid. I scanned the woods again, my eyes straining in the darkness. Still nothing. Just trees, shadows, and that oppressive silence. Maybe it was just a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. Something harmless. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach said otherwise. This wasn't just some animal in the woods. This was something else. "Come on, Cooper," I said, tugging gently on his leash. "Let's head back to the Wanderer. Time to get some dinner going." He hesitated for another moment, still staring into the darkness, then finally turned and followed me, his growl subsiding to a low whine. Back inside the RV, I locked the door, even though I knew it was probably just a flimsy piece of aluminum and plywood. It was more for psychological comfort than actual security. I drew the curtains, shutting out the encroaching darkness, and flicked on the propane heater, the small space slowly starting to warm up. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, chalking it up to fatigue and too much time alone with my thoughts. I opened a can of chili, heated it up on the small stove, and poured myself a lukewarm beer. Dinner of champions. Right as I ate, the silence outside seemed to press even closer. The RV felt like a tiny island of light and warmth in a sea of darkness. I glanced at the windows, half expecting to see what. I didn't know. But the feeling of being watched, of being observed by something unseen in the woods, was growing stronger with each passing minute. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence. A snapping twig just outside the RV, close enough to make me jump. Cooper instantly went rigid, barking sharply, a full-throated alarm. My heart leaped into my throat, chili forgotten in my lap. I froze listening, every nerve ending screaming. Silence again. Then another snap, closer this time. And then a soft, shuffling sound, like something dragging itself through the leaves, just beyond the thin walls of the Wanderer. Cooper was going ballistic now, barking and growling, throwing himself against the door. I grabbed the axe, my hands slick with sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever was out there, it was no deer. And it was definitely not harmless. I peered cautiously through a gap in the curtains, my eyes straining in the darkness. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, I saw them. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the RV's dim porch light, were figures. Tall, gaunt figures, barely visible in the shadows, their forms indistinct and wavering like heat haze on a summer road. There were several of them, maybe 5 or 6, spread out in a loose semicircle, facing the Wanderer. They were perfectly still, unnervingly so, just standing there silent, watching, waiting. And that's when I understood the sign. Leave before dark. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. And I, like an idiot, had ignored it. My blood ran cold. Those figures, they were just standing there, motionless at the edge of the woods. Tall and distinct and utterly silent, like statues carved from shadow. Cooper was losing his mind, barking and clawing at the door, but I was frozen, paralyzed by a primal fear I'd never felt before. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that these weren't people. Not in any way I understood the word. There was something fundamentally wrong about them, something ancient and malevolent lurking just beneath the surface of their vaguely human shapes. The shuffling sound started again, closer now, right outside the RV. It was a slow, deliberate drag like heavy feet scraping through dry leaves. I risked another peek through the curtains. One of the figures was moving. It was gliding, almost floating, across the clearing, coming straight for the Wanderer. Its form sharpened as it approached, resolving into something vaguely humanoid, but impossibly gaunt and elongated. Its limbs were too long, its torso too thin, its head a featureless oval in the dim light. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. And then I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was just emptiness. A smooth, blank surface, devoid of eyes, nose, mouth. A void where humanity should have been. Terror finally broke through my paralysis. I scrambled back from the window, stumbling over the small table, knocking over my half-eaten chili. "Jet away!" I yelled, my voice cracking, though I knew they couldn't hear me, or if they could, they wouldn't care. Cooper was still barking frantically, a desperate, terrified sound. I grabbed the axe, my knuckles white around the handle. It felt pathetic, a flimsy tool against whatever these things were, but it was all I had. The shuffling stopped right outside the RV door. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body clenched tight. The silence stretched agonizingly, broken only by Cooper's frantic whimpering. Then a new sound, a soft tapping, like fingernails brushing against the aluminum siding of the Wanderer. Slow, deliberative, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It was methodical, unnervingly patient, like whatever was out there knew it had all the time in the world. Tap, tap, tap. It moved around the RV, the tapping tracing a slow circle, each tap resonating in the cramped space, amplifying the dread that was building inside me. Tap, tap, tap. It reached the window beside the dinette. I shrank back against the wall, axe raised, heart hammering against my ribs. Tap, 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 right outside the window now, inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating off it, a palpable chill that seeped through the glass. And then the tapping stopped. Silence again, heavier than ever. I held my breath, waiting, expecting I didn't know what. For the door to be ripped open. For the window to shatter. For that thing to somehow phase through the metal and plywood, and nothing. Just silence. And the oppressive feeling of being watched. After an eternity that could have been minutes or hours, I dared to breathe again. Slowly, cautiously, I crept back to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. The figure was still there, right outside the window, its blank face turned towards me. But now it was different. It was closer, impossibly close. It seemed to have grown. Taller, bulkier, its form less indistinct, more solid. And in the featureless void where its face should have been, something was starting to appear. Faint lines like cracks in porcelain, etching themselves into the blank surface. Lines that slowly, agonizingly, began to coalesce into features eyes. 2 empty sockets, blacker than the surrounding night, opening in that blank face. No pupils, no irises, just bottomless pits of darkness. They stared directly at me, and I felt a cold dread seep into my soul, a sense of utter and complete annihilation. And then a mouth, a thin, lifeless gash, appearing below the eye sockets, stretching impossibly wide, wider than any human mouth could ever open. It stretched and stretched until it seemed to bisect the entire featureless oval, a gaping maw of darkness. A voice, thin and reedy like dry leaves rustling in a dead wind, whispered from that impossible mouth. It wasn't directed at my ears, not exactly. It was inside my head, a cold, invasive presence that bypassed my senses and went straight to my mind. Jonas Jacob. The words weren't spoken, not in the way humans speak. They were projected, implanted directly into my thoughts, cold and alien and utterly devoid of emotion. The silence is waiting. The other figures in the clearing started to move then, slowly, deliberately, gliding forward, their blank faces also turning towards the Wanderer. The tapping started again all around the RV now, a chorus of rhythmic strikes. Tap, 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 the whispering voices joined in, a chorus of dry, rustling whispers, all saying the same thing over and over. Join us, join us, join us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare paralyzed as the figures closed in, the tapping growing louder, the whispers growing stronger, the cold seeping deeper into my bones. Then Cooper. Despite his terror, despite the overwhelming dread that was crushing me, Cooper found his courage. He launched himself at the door again, barking with a ferocity that shook me out of my stupor. His loyalty, his unwavering presence, cut through the fear, a tiny spark of defiance in the encroaching darkness. And something snapped in me. Rage, maybe. Desperation. A refusal to simply surrender to this thing. I grabbed the axe, not as a weapon, not anymore, but as a tool. A tool to escape. I knew instinctively that fighting them was pointless. They weren't flesh and blood. They were something else, something ancient and unknowable. But the Wanderer was still solid, still real. And maybe, just maybe, it could be my way out. Ignoring the tapping, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the figures closing in, I scrambled to the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip them. Cooper was still barking, a frantic, desperate sound, but I ignored him too, focusing all my will on the simple act of starting the engine. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The RV shuddered, vibrating with a sudden noise, a defiant roar against the oppressive silence. I slammed the gearshift into drive, foot heavy on the gas pedal, and the Wanderer lurched forward, crashing through the picnic table, scattering fire rings, tearing through the undergrowth. Branches scraped against the sides of the RV, leaves and twigs showering the windshield. I didn't care. I just kept driving, blindly, desperately, back the way I had come, bouncing and rattling over the uneven ground, the engine screaming in protest. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures were still there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me go. They didn't pursue. They didn't need to. They knew and I knew that I was leaving something behind in Silent Creek Campground, something I could never truly escape. I drove all night, not stopping, not slowing down, not even looking back. I didn't stop until the sun was high in the sky, until I was back on the interstate, surrounded by the noise and bustle of civilization, the familiar, comforting banality of the everyday world. I'm in a motel now, miles away from Nebraska, miles away from Silent Creek. Cooper is asleep at my feet, exhausted but safe. I keep looking at him, touching him, reassuring myself that he's real, that I'm real. But the silence is still with me. It's in my ears, in my head, in the spaces between my thoughts. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them. Those tall, gaunt figures, standing at the edge of the darkness, their blank faces turned towards me, their empty sockets waiting. And I hear the whispers, soft and dry, carried on a dead wind. Join us, Jake, the silence of his waiting. I don't know what they are. Those things in Silent Creek Campground. I don't know what they want. But I know one thing for sure. I made a deadly mistake going there. And I fear, with every fiber of my being, that I'll be paying the price for that mistake for the rest of my days. If you ever see a sign that says leave before dark, take it seriously. Because sometimes the silence isn't just silence. Sometimes it's listening back. And sometimes it's waiting for you to join it. Story 11. My name is Daniel, but most folks just call me Dan. I'm about as average American as they come, I guess. 30-something, work a desk job pushing papers around, and live in a cookie-cutter house in the suburbs. Nothing too exciting, you know. That's probably why the idea of an RV camping trip sounded so appealing. My wife, Sarah, had been nagging me for ages to get out of my shell and experience nature. Honestly, I'm more of a nature documentary on the couch kind of guy, but Sarah can be pretty persuasive, especially when she flashes those puppy dog eyes. So we rented an RV to Real Beast, bigger than my first apartment, and decided on Nebraska. Why Nebraska? Well, Sarah had this idea about seeing the wide, open skies and the cornfields stretching to the horizon. Plus, it was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, and away from the crowds. Just what we need to reconnect, she'd said, all dreamy-eyed. I'll admit, driving that RV felt kind of cool at first. Like we were in our own little rolling house, the world unfolding outside the windshield. We packed enough snacks to feed a small army, loaded up some cheesy road trip playlists, and pointed that Lanyard west. Nebraska in late summer as well, it's Nebraska flat. Really flat. And corn. Corn as far as the eye could see. But there was a certain stark beauty to it, I guess. The sky was huge, a brilliant, almost painful blue, and the air was hot and dry, smelling of sun, baked earth, and something else. Something faint, almost metallic, that I couldn't quite place. We found a campsite in a state recreation area, Lakeside Campground it was called. Sounded idyllic, right? It was okay. The lake was more of a big pond, and the campground was mostly empty. Just a couple of other RVs scattered around, looking kind of lonely in the vastness of the landscape. The park ranger, a woman with eyes that seemed to have seen too much sun, just nodded and handed us a map, pointing out the usual stuff: fire pits, restrooms, trailheads. She didn't say much, just gave us this look, like she expected us to turn around and head back east. Setting up camp was surprisingly easy. Sarah was actually pretty handy with the RV hookups, and before long we had the awning out, chairs set up, and the smell of grilling burgers filling the air. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in these crazy shades of orange and purple. It was peaceful. Quiet. Maybe a little too quiet. As dusk settled, that metallic smell got stronger, hanging in the air like a weird perfume. And the silence of it was heavy. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but something else, like the world was holding its breath. Sarah didn't seem to notice, chattering away about how relaxing it was. But I felt it, a prickle at the back of my neck, a tightness in my chest. Something wasn't right. Then it happened. Just as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon and the stars started to pop out, we heard it. A sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't an animal. It was a low, guttural moan. Distant but clear, like something in pain. Or something hungry. Sarah stopped talking, her burger halfway to her mouth. We both just froze, listening. The silence returned, heavier than before. And in the darkness beyond the RV, I felt like something was watching us. Something ancient and very, very cold. What was that? Sarah whispered, finally breaking the silence. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering light of the campfire. I tried to play it cool, forcing a nervous laugh. Probably just a cow. This is Nebraska after all. But even to my own ears, it sounded weak. Cows don't moan like that. And cows definitely don't make you feel like you're being stared at by something unseen. Sarah wasn't buying it. It didn't sound like a cow, Dan. It sounded human. But wrong. She shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her. We sat there for a long time, the fire crackling, the silence pressing in. The stars were incredible, a million pinpricks of light in the inky blackness. But they didn't feel comforting. They felt cold, distant, indifferent to whatever was lurking in the darkness around us. The metallic smell was still there, stronger now, almost acrid. It was starting to make my head ache. Finally, I decided to try and be rational. Look, it's probably just the wind playing tricks, or some kind of animal we don't recognize. We're in the middle of nowhere, remember. Lots of weird sounds out here. I tried to sound reassuring, but I didn't believe my own words. We finished our burgers in silence, the food suddenly tasting like ash in my mouth. We cleaned up quickly, the usual campfire banner completely absent. As we retreated into the RV, locking the door behind us felt less like a precaution and more like barricading ourselves against something. Inside, the RV felt small, cramped. No longer our cozy rolling home, but a flimsy metal box against an unknown threat. We turned on all the lights, trying to push back the darkness. But it felt like the darkness was seeping in through the walls, through the windows, filling the space with a cold dread. We tried to watch TV, flipping through channels. But nothing held our attention. The cheerful sitcoms, the upbeat news anchors, they all felt jarringly out of place, like broadcasts from another world. A world that didn't know about the moan in the dark, the metallic smell, the feeling of being watched. Eventually, Sarah went to bed, claiming exhaustion. I knew she was just as scared as I was, but she was better at pretending. I stayed up, sitting in the dinette, staring out the window into the blackness. The stars seemed to have intensified, burning brighter, colder, and the silence, it was alive. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums, a silence that whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. Then the whispers started, faint and distinct, just at the edge of hearing, like voices carried on the wind, too low to understand, but undeniably there. They seemed to come from all directions, swirling around the RV, murmuring just beyond the thin metal walls. I strained my ears, trying to make out words, but it was just a constant low hum of sound, like a chorus of voices speaking a language I didn't know, a language that wasn't meant for human ears. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was deeply unsettling, a sound that crawled under your skin and made your teeth itch. I checked on Sarah. She was asleep or pretending to be, her breathing shallow and uneven. I didn't want to wake her, didn't want to admit that something was really wrong. I told myself it was just the wind, the trees, my imagination running wild. But the whispers continued, growing subtly louder, more insistent. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to find a rational explanation, I decided to go outside. Stupid, I know. But the RV was starting to feel like a trap, the whispers closing in, suffocating me. I needed fresh air, needed to see something, anything, to break the spell of dread. I grabbed a flashlight, unlocked the door as quietly as I could, and stepped out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and the metallic smell was almost overpowering now, thick and cloying. The stars blazed overhead, casting long, sharp shadows from the trees, and the silencing, it was absolute. The whispers were gone. Relief washed over me, so strong it almost made me weak. See, just my imagination. I was being ridiculous. It was just the woods, the night, nothing to be scared of. I took a deep breath, ready to go back inside, to laugh at myself for being so jumpy. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the campground, just beyond the circle of firelight from the distant RVs, something moved. A flicker of shadow, a shift in the darkness. I pointed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the night, and there it was. Standing just inside the tree line, watching me. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct in the shadows. But I could see it, just enough. A shape that wasn't quite human, but similar. Long limbs, a hunched posture, and a head that seemed too small for its body. And eyes. 2 eyes burned with a cold, pale light fixed on me. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And in the silence, I heard the whispers again. But they weren't distant anymore. They were inside my head. Not spoken words, but thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of them cold, hungry, and utterly alien. And they were all directed at me. Come closer, we're waiting, you're invited, join as I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, scrambling for the RV door, my heart hammering against my ribs, the whispers echoing in my skull, the cold eyes burning into my soul. I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt. Inside, the RV felt even smaller, even more like a trap. But at least for now I was inside, and it was outside, waiting. I didn't sleep. How could I? The whispers were still there, even inside the RV, a constant, insidious hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. Sarah woke up a few hours later, pale and drawn, asking what was wrong. I tried to downplay it, mumbled something about a bad dream, but she saw the fear in my eyes. She'd heard the moan, felt the oppressive silence. She knew something was wrong too. We need to leave, she said, her voice barely a whisper. No, I didn't argue. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that place, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was out there in the dark. We packed up in a frenzy, throwing things haphazardly into bags, skipping breakfast, ignoring the lingering metallic stench that seemed to cling to everything. The RV felt tainted now, contaminated. I just wanted to abandon it, run, but it was our only way out. Starting the RV was agony. The engine cuffed and sputtered, protesting the cold morning air, the oppressive silence. Each failed attempt ratcheted up the tension, the feeling of being trapped. Finally, with a shuddering roar, it turned over. Relief flooded me, quickly replaced by a fresh wave of dread. We weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. I threw the RV into gear and lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. I didn't bother with the usual campground courtesies, just slammed the accelerator and barreled down the narrow park road, trees whipping past in a blur. Sarah gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The campground was deserted. The other RVs were still there, silent, lifeless. No sign of their occupants. It was like everyone had vanished overnight. Or worse. The whispers seemed to intensify as we drove, a chorus of unseen voices urging us to stay, to turn back, to join them. I gritted my teeth, pushing the RV faster, ignoring the protests of the engine, the swaying of the oversized vehicle. We reached the main park road, the one that was supposed to lead back to civilization. But something was wrong. The road wasn't right. It was narrower than I remembered, overgrown with weeds, cracked and crumbling in places. It looked older, like it hadn't been used in years. "This isn't the way we came in," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." I knew it. The landscape was subtly different. The trees taller, denser, the air heavier, more oppressive. We were lost. Or worse, we were being led somewhere. Somewhere we didn't want to go. I slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. "We need to turn around," I said, my voice hoarse. "Go back to the campground. Maybe you missed a turn." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, we can't go back there." She was right. Going back to the campground felt like driving straight into the jaws of a trap. But going forward this road, this twisted, overgrown path, it felt even worse. Like it was leading us deeper into something ancient and malevolent. As if in answer, the whispers intensified, swirling around the RV, no longer just murmuring, but chanting a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated in my bones. And the metallic smell of it was overwhelming now, thick and coppery, filling the RV, coating my tongue with a taste like rust and blood. Then, up ahead, in the middle of the road, I saw them. Figures standing in the mist, blocking our path. Tall, shadowy figures, indistinct in the morning haze, but undeniably there. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core what they were. They were the whispers. They were the silence. They were the hunger in the dark. I slammed the RV into reverse, tires screaming, gravel flying. But it was too late. They were moving, gliding towards us impossibly fast. Their forms shifting and blurring in the mist. I could see them more clearly now. Humanoid, but twisted, elongated, their limbs too long, their heads too small, their eyes burning with that cold, pale light. Sarah screamed a raw animal sound of pure terror. I gripped the steering wheel, my hands slick with sweat, my mind racing, desperate for an escape. But there was none. We were trapped in this RV on this road, with these things closing in. The RV stalled, just died. The engine cud one last time and went silent, leaving us in a silence that was suddenly, terrifyingly complete. The whispers stopped. The metallic smell vanished. Only the cold, heavy silence remained, and the figures now closer, clearer, their eyes burning like embers in the mist. One of them stepped forward, its form resolving, becoming familiar. It was tall, lanky, wearing clothes that looked vaguely like mine. And then I saw its face, my face. But not quite. Twisted, stretched, the features subtly wrong, the skin pale and translucent like stretched parchment, and the eyes, those cold, pale eyes, fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. It smiled. That same, lingering too long smile I'd seen in my nightmare in Jake Smith's story. And in that smile, I saw not hunger, not malice, but something far worse. Invitation. It raised a hand, beckoning us, and in the silence and the metallic taste in my mouth and the cold dread that had settled in my bones, I understood this wasn't a mistake. This was a destination, and we had arrived. The RV door creaked open, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we were going to accept the invitation, because in the silence of that Nebraska morning, surrounded by the cornfields and the whispers, there was no other choice. The road west had ended, and something else was about to begin.